Welcome, young wizard, to a tale of courage forged in darkness and hope kindled in the deepest shadows of despair. Tonight, we follow the extraordinary story of the Order of the Phoenix, a secret society of brave witches and wizards who dared to stand against the rising tide of evil when all seemed lost. As you settle into your cozy sanctuary, let these words carry you through the chronicles of heroes who chose light over darkness, sacrifice over safety, and love over fear. Close your eyes and drift into this epic of vigilance, where every member's story was written in both triumph and tragedy, where the phoenix rose from ashes time and again. The year 1970 marked a turning point in the wizarding world, though few recognized the significance of what was beginning to unfold in the shadows of magical Britain. In the quiet corridors of Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Albus Dumbledore sat in his circular office, surrounded by whirring silver instruments and sleeping portraits, contemplating intelligence reports that painted an increasingly troubling picture of the magical community's future. The name Tom Marvolo Riddle had not been spoken aloud in these chambers for many years, but the spectre of what that brilliant former student had become haunted every decision the aging headmaster now faced. The transformation had been gradual but inexorable, like watching a beloved tree succumb to some invisible blight that corrupted it from within, until nothing remained but a twisted shadow of its former beauty. Tom Riddle, once the most promising student Hogwarts had seen in generations, had disappeared into the darker corners of the magical world, only to emerge as something that could barely be considered human. The name Voldemort was whispered in fearful tones by those brave enough to speak of him at all, while others referred to him only as you-know-who, or he who must not be named, as if avoiding his name could somehow diminish his growing power. Dumbledore understood better than most the magnitude of the threat they were facing. This was not merely another dark wizard seeking power through conventional means, but something unprecedented in the recorded history of magic. Voldemort's experiments with immortality, his gathering of followers who called themselves Death Eaters, his systematic elimination of those who opposed his vision of magical supremacy, all pointed to an enemy whose ambitions extended far beyond simple conquest to encompass the complete reshaping of wizarding civilization according to his twisted ideals. The Ministry of Magic, with its bureaucratic processes and political considerations, was proving woefully inadequate to address a threat that operated outside the boundaries of conventional magical law. Minister Mincham and his administration seemed more concerned with maintaining public confidence than acknowledging the scope of the crisis they faced. Official responses were slow, often counterproductive, and hampered by the very democratic processes that made the ministry legitimate but rendered it ineffective against an enemy who recognized no authority save his own will. It was during those long nights in his office, watching the sleeping portraits of former headmasters and listening to the gentle whirring of instruments that monitored magical disturbances across Britain, that Dumbledore came to understand the necessity of creating something new. The established order, with its rules and procedures and careful deliberations, could not move with the speed and decisiveness that the coming conflict would demand. What was needed was a smaller, more flexible organization, one that could operate in the shadows where Voldemort's influence was strongest, guided by principle rather than policy, and bound by loyalty rather than legal obligation. The first person he approached was Minerva McGonagall, his deputy headmistress and one of the most formidable witches of her generation. Their conversation took place in her private quarters on a winter evening when snow fell heavily outside the castle windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy that seemed to separate them from the larger world and its growing troubles. McGonagall listened with characteristic intensity as Dumbledore outlined his concerns about Voldemort's activities and the inadequacy of official responses to the emerging threat. Her agreement to join what would become the Order of the Phoenix was immediate and absolute, reflecting not just her trust in Dumbledore's judgment, but her own understanding of the stakes involved. As someone who had taught Tom Riddle during his student years, she had witnessed firsthand the gradual corruption of a brilliant mind by ambitions that recognized no moral boundaries. The boy who had charmed teachers and intimidated fellow students had grown into something that threatened the very foundations of the civilized magical world. Rubeus Hagrid was the next recruit, though his inclusion was controversial even among the small circle who knew of the organization's existence. His expulsion from Hogwarts decades earlier, and his sometimes questionable judgment, made him seem an unlikely candidate for such sensitive work. But Dumbledore understood qualities in the half-giant that others missed. An absolute loyalty to those he considered friends, a courage that never faltered, regardless of the odds, and most importantly, connections within the magical community that extended far beyond what his simple manner might suggest. Hagrid's recruitment demonstrated one of Dumbledore's key insights about the coming conflict, that victory would depend not just on magical power or tactical brilliance, but on the ability to inspire loyalty among people who might otherwise be overlooked or marginalized by traditional authority structures. The half-giant's enthusiasm for the cause was infectious, his willingness to take enormous risks for his friend's legendary, and his knowledge of magical creatures and the wilder corners of the wizarding world, invaluable for operations that would require unconventional approaches. The early Aurors who joined the Order came primarily through personal relationships with Dumbledore that had been built over decades of cooperation between Hogwarts and the Ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement. These were experienced law enforcement officers who understood the limitations of their official mandate and were willing to work outside normal channels when circumstances demanded it. They brought professional expertise in magical combat, investigation techniques, and the practical aspects of pursuing dangerous criminals through a world where magic made conventional police work obsolete. Among these early Auror recruits was Alastor Moody, though he was still years away from the legendary status and distinctive appearance that would define his later career. At this stage, he was simply one of the most effective dark wizard hunters the Ministry employed, someone whose dedication to protecting innocent lives made him willing to consider approaches that his more politically minded colleagues might find uncomfortable. His recruitment marked the beginning of a partnership between Dumbledore and the Auror Department's most uncompromising members that would prove crucial to the Order's effectiveness throughout the coming war. The establishment of safe houses represented one of the Order's first major organizational challenges, requiring locations that could be protected by the most advanced concealment magic while remaining accessible to members who might need to reach them under dangerous circumstances. Dumbledore's extensive knowledge of magical Britain, accumulated over decades of travel and study, proved invaluable in identifying properties that met these contradictory requirements. Ancient cottages protected by family magic, abandoned manor houses with built-in defensive enchantments, even Muggle properties that could be hidden through carefully applied charms. Each location required individual assessment and customized protection schemes. The process of securing these refuges revealed the scope of magical knowledge that would be required to sustain a clandestine organization in a world where conventional hiding places offered no protection against enemies who could apparachi, use tracking spells, or employ magical creatures as scouts and spies. Every ward scheme had to account for detection methods that Muggle resistance movements never faced, while concealment charms needed to fool not just human observers but magical instruments, and enhance senses that could perceive things hidden from normal sight. Perhaps the most innovative aspect of the early order was Dumbledore's modification of the Patronus charm to serve as a secure communication system between members. The magic required was enormously complex, transforming what was essentially a defensive spell into something approaching telepathy while maintaining the security advantages that made traditional magical communication methods vulnerable to interception. Each member's Patronus carried not just their message but their magical signature, making forgery effectively impossible while allowing for verification of identity even under the most dangerous circumstances. The development of this communication network required months of careful experimentation and testing, with volunteers risking magical exhaustion and worse as Dumbledore refined techniques that pushed the boundaries of what individual wizards could safely attempt. The final system was elegant in its simplicity. A corporeal Patronus could carry spoken messages across vast distances instantaneously, immune to the interception methods that compromised Owlpost and Flu networks, while providing absolute certainty about the sender's identity through magical signatures that were as unique as fingerprints. Early missions during this formative period were primarily intelligence-gathering operations designed to understand the scope of Voldemort's organization and identify key figures within his growing network of supporters. These were dangerous assignments that required skills more associated with espionage than traditional magical law enforcement. The ability to maintain cover identities under stress, to extract information from unwilling sources without leaving traces that might compromise future operations, and most crucially, to recognize when gathering additional intelligence was worth the risks involved, and when discretion demanded immediate withdrawal. The Order members who undertook these missions faced psychological challenges that their magical education had never prepared them for. Infiltrating Death Eater gatherings meant witnessing atrocities that challenged every assumption about civilized behavior, while maintaining their cover required appearing to approve of actions that violated their deepest moral convictions. The compartmentalization necessary to survive such assignments left lasting scars on even the most resilient operatives, creating a hidden cost of resistance that families and friends of Order members could never fully understand. But perhaps the most valuable intelligence gathered during these early operations was not about Voldemort's specific plans or the identities of his followers, but about his psychological profile and the methods he used to recruit and control his growing army. Understanding that the Dark Lord was not simply a powerful wizard seeking dominion, but something approaching a psychological phenomenon that fed on fear and despair, was crucial to developing effective countermeasures. His followers weren't just criminals seeking personal advantage, but true believers in an ideology that promised them significance in exchange for absolute obedience to their master's will. The philosophy that guided the Order's formation was both simple and revolutionary, that protecting innocent life was a moral imperative that transcended legal authority when official channels proved inadequate to the task. This wasn't anarchism but principled resistance, guided by ethical considerations that placed the welfare of potential victims above respect for institutional procedures that had proven insufficient to address unprecedented threats. Dumbledore understood that such an organization would inevitably operate in legal grey areas, but he also recognized that moral clarity could provide guidance when conventional law offered no answers. This philosophical foundation would prove crucial as the Order's activities escalated from intelligence gathering to direct action against Death Eater operations. The decision to move beyond passive observation to active interference required each member to accept personal responsibility for consequences that might include not just their own death, but potential retaliation against their families and associates. The knowledge that joining the Order meant placing everyone you cared about at risk created a barrier to recruitment that was both necessary for security and psychologically devastating for those who chose to cross it. The early victories achieved by Order operations were small but significant, demonstrating that Voldemort's forces were not invulnerable, and that coordinated resistance could disrupt their activities in meaningful ways. Raids on Death Eater safe houses yielded intelligence about planned attacks on Muggle communities, while the capture or elimination of key operatives forced the enemy to divert resources to replacing personnel and rebuilding compromised networks. Each success created opportunities for additional operations, while proving to potential recruits that the Order represented a genuine alternative to passive acceptance of escalating violence. But these victories also revealed the true nature of the enemy they faced, and the costs that effective resistance would demand from those willing to pay them. Death Eaters who were captured rarely survived long enough to provide useful information, either through suicide missions designed to prevent interrogation or rescue attempts that eliminated witnesses, along with their primary objectives. The magical techniques employed by Voldemort's followers were often experimental and always vicious, designed not just to kill, but to terrorize through demonstration of power that transcended normal human limitations. As 1971 dawned and the Order began its second year of existence, Dumbledore understood that they had passed the point of no return in their commitment to opposing Voldemort through methods that the Ministry would never officially sanction. The organization that had begun as a small group of concerned individuals had evolved into something approaching a shadow government, complete with intelligence networks, military capabilities, and the philosophical framework necessary to sustain operations that would be measured in years rather than months. The phoenix that would give them their name was still taking shape, but already its wings were spreading to cover a growing number of people who looked to it for protection that no other source could provide. The magical Britain that emerged from this period of organizational development was fundamentally different from what had existed before, though most of its citizens remained unaware of the changes taking place in the shadows that surrounded their daily lives. The Order of the Phoenix had established itself as a permanent feature of the landscape, ready to grow and adapt as circumstances demanded, guided by principles that would sustain it through the darkest hours yet to come. In the quiet moments between crises, when members gathered in safe houses to share intelligence and plan operations, they were creating something unprecedented in magical history, a resistance movement that could match Voldemort's ruthlessness with superior organization, his cruelty with principled determination, and his despair with hope that refused to be extinguished regardless of the prices demanded for its preservation. The autumn of 1977 brought with it a chill that seemed to penetrate not just the Scottish Highlands, but the very soul of magical Britain, as if the approaching winter carried whispers of darkness that would soon engulf the wizarding world in ways that few could have imagined. It was during this season of dying leaves and shortened days that 5 young people, barely out of their Hogwarts years, found themselves summoned to a meeting that would forever alter the trajectory of their lives and bind them to a cause that would demand everything they had to give. James Potter stood in the drawing room of his family's ancestral home, his black hair as unruly as ever, despite Lily's attempts to tame it for what she had called an important occasion. At 21, he possessed the kind of confidence that came from a childhood spent knowing he was loved unconditionally, combined with the magical ability that had made him one of Hogwarts' most celebrated students. But beneath the surface charm and easy smile lay something deeper, a moral certainty that had been forged through years of standing up to bullies and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, qualities that made him precisely the kind of person Albus Dumbledore sought for the most dangerous work imaginable. Beside him, Lily Evans Potter radiated the quiet strength that had first attracted him during their school years, though her beauty was now tempered by an awareness of the world's capacity for cruelty that their sheltered academic life had never fully revealed. Her Muggle-born heritage made her a target in Voldemort's campaign of pure blood supremacy. But more than that, it gave her a perspective on magical society that those raised within it often lacked. She understood that the freedoms and opportunities that pure-blood wizards took for granted were privileges that could be revoked at any moment by those with sufficient power and sufficiently twisted ideology. Sirius Black's presence in this gathering represented a rejection of everything his family had stood for, across generations of pure-blood fanaticism and dark magic allegiance. His decision to stand with his friends rather than his bloodline had cost him his inheritance, his home, and his relationship with everyone who shared his surname. But it had also freed him to become the person he truly was, rather than the heir his family had tried to shape him into. The psychological scars left by years of emotional abuse and ideological pressure were hidden beneath his characteristic irreverence, but they made his commitment to opposing Voldemort's cause intensely personal, in ways that went beyond abstract moral principles. Remus Lupin carried burdens that his friends could understand intellectually but never experience directly. The monthly agony of lycanthropic transformation, the social stigma that made employment nearly impossible, and the constant awareness that his condition made him a potential weapon in the hands of anyone cruel enough to exploit it. Fenrir Greyback's recruitment by Voldemort had given the Dark Lord access to werewolf communities that had been marginalized and brutalized for centuries, offering them revenge against the magical society that had rejected them in exchange for service to a cause that would ultimately destroy everything they claimed to want. For Remus, the war represented not just a conflict between good and evil, but a deeply personal struggle to prove that lycanthropy didn't define character or destiny. Peter Pettigrew stood slightly apart from his friends, his round face bearing an expression of nervous excitement that masked deeper currents of insecurity and resentment that none of them had fully recognized. Throughout their Hogwarts years, he had been the tag-along, the friend who was included more from loyalty than from genuine appreciation of his contributions to their group dynamic. His magical abilities were adequate but unremarkable, his courage sufficient for schoolboy adventures but untested by real danger, and his sense of self-worth increasingly dependent on his association with friends whose talents and prospects far exceeded his own. The invitation to join something as significant as the Order of the Phoenix represented an opportunity to prove himself worthy of their friendship, but it also highlighted the gap between his abilities and theirs in ways that fed the growing darkness in his soul. Dumbledore's arrival was announced not by the usual theatrical flourishes that marked his public appearances, but by a subtle shift in the room's magical atmosphere that made everyone present suddenly aware that they were in the presence of power that transcended normal human limitations. The aging wizard moved with deliberate grace, his blue eyes holding depths of knowledge and sorrow that spoke of decades spent making decisions that lesser souls couldn't comprehend or bear. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority tempered by genuine affection for the young people he was about to ask to risk everything for a cause that offered no guarantee of victory or survival. The revelation of the Order of the Phoenix's existence came as confirmation of rumors that had circulated through certain circles for years, whispers of a secret organization that operated beyond ministry oversight, conducting operations that official law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't undertake. But learning of its reality was different from suspecting its existence, particularly when accompanied by an invitation to join its ranks and accept the responsibilities that membership entailed. This wasn't just another school organization or social club, but a commitment to warfare against enemies who would show no mercy to captured members or their families and associates. Dumbledore's explanation of the Order's mission was comprehensive but sobering, outlining the scope of Voldemort's organization and the inadequacy of conventional responses to threats that operated outside the boundaries of civilized magical society. The Death Eaters weren't simply criminals seeking personal gain, but ideological fanatics whose vision of magical supremacy required the systematic elimination of anyone who didn't meet their standards of blood purity. Their methods included not just murder, but psychological torture designed to break the spirits of entire communities, magical techniques that pushed the boundaries of what most wizards considered possible or acceptable, and recruitment strategies that exploited existing social tensions to build a movement that transcended simple criminal enterprise. The ministry's response to this escalating threat had been hampered by political considerations that prioritized public confidence over effective action, bureaucratic procedures that moved too slowly to address rapidly evolving situations, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's true nature and capabilities. Minister Harold Mincham's administration seemed more concerned with maintaining the appearance of normalcy than acknowledging the reality that normal approaches to law enforcement were proving catastrophically inadequate. This institutional failure created both the necessity and the opportunity for alternative approaches that could operate with the speed and decisiveness that the situation demanded. James's acceptance of membership was immediate and unequivocal, reflecting not just his personal courage, but his understanding that his privileged upbringing created obligations to those who lacked his advantages and protections. His pure blood status and family wealth could have provided insulation from the worst consequences of Voldemort's rise, but they also made him acutely aware of his responsibility to use those privileges in service of something larger than personal comfort or safety. The magical abilities that had made him a star athlete and popular student were about to be tested in ways that Quidditch matches and academic competitions had never demanded. Lily's commitment to the Order came from a different place, but was equally absolute, rooted in her first-hand knowledge of what Muggle-born wizards faced in a society where their very existence was considered an abomination by growing numbers of magical extremists. Her sister's rejection and her parents' inability to understand the magical world had given her unique insight into the isolation experienced by those caught between two worlds, while her academic brilliance and natural leadership abilities made her invaluable for operations that required both magical skill and strategic thinking. The protective spells she would later cast were already taking shape in her mind, though she couldn't yet know how crucial they would prove to be. Sirius's enthusiasm for joining the fight against his family's ideology was tempered by understanding of what his participation would cost him and those around him. The Black family's connections to Death Eater networks made him a high-value target whose capture could provide enemies with intelligence about Order operations, while his insider knowledge of Pure Blood Society's power structures made him uniquely valuable for infiltration and intelligence-gathering missions. His decision to stand with his friends rather than his blood meant accepting permanent exile from the world he had been born to inherit, but it also represented the final step in his transformation from reluctant heir to genuine hero. Remus's acceptance came despite his awareness that his lycanthropy made him a security risk, whose monthly transformations would limit his operational availability and whose condition could be exploited by enemies who understood how to manipulate the psychological and physical vulnerabilities that came with his curse. But Dumbledore's willingness to include him despite these limitations represented the first time in years that anyone had looked beyond his condition to see the person underneath, while the Order's mission offered him a chance to prove that werewolves could be forces for good rather than instruments of destruction in the hands of those who would use them as weapons. Peter's agreement was the most complex and conflicted, reflecting his desperate need to prove himself worthy of his friend's respect, while harboring private doubts about his ability to contribute meaningfully to such a significant cause. The magical skills that had been adequate for school pranks and adolescent adventures seemed pathetically insufficient when measured against the requirements of warfare against enemies whose power and ruthlessness exceeded anything in his paeans. Experience, but the opportunity to finally distinguish himself, to be part of something important enough to risk his life for, was too appealing to resist, despite the voice in his head that whispered warnings about his inadequacy and likely failure. The training that followed their recruitment was unlike anything they had experienced at Hogwarts, designed not just to enhance their magical abilities, but to prepare them psychologically for realities that their sheltered educational experience had never addressed. Combat magic was different from the defensive spells taught in standard curriculum, requiring not just technical proficiency, but the mental conditioning necessary to use potentially lethal force against human opponents, who would certainly try to kill them without hesitation or remorse. The transition from academic exercises to actual warfare demanded personality changes that some recruits couldn't make, while others adapted so completely that they risked losing essential aspects of their humanity in the process. Alastair Moody's involvement in their preparation was both inspiring and terrifying, demonstrating through personal example what years of hunting dark wizards could do to even the strongest personalities. His paranoid vigilance was legendary among Auror ranks, but working with him directly revealed the psychological costs of maintaining such constant awareness of potential threats. The magical devices he carried clicked and hummed with warnings about dangers that others couldn't perceive, while his artificial eye never stopped moving as it scanned for hidden enemies and concealed weapons that might not even exist. He was living proof that effective resistance to dark magic required sacrifices that went far beyond physical risk to encompass fundamental changes in how one perceived and interacted with the world. The Order's operational structure during this period was necessarily fluid and decentralized, designed to minimize the consequences of any individual member's capture or compromise while maintaining the coordination necessary for complex multi-person missions. Communication networks established during the organization's early years proved their worth as intelligence flowed between cells of operatives who often didn't know each other's identities, while safe houses provided staging areas for operations and refuge for members whose covers had been blown or whose families were under immediate threat. James and Lily's first mission together took them deep into magical London's underground, where they posed as young Death Eater sympathizers, seeking to prove their commitment to Voldemort's cause through participation in increasingly dangerous activities. The psychological challenge of maintaining such covers was enormous, requiring them to express enthusiasm for ideologies they found abhorrent while gathering intelligence about planned attacks on Muggle communities. The moral complexity of their situation was compounded by the knowledge that their success might prevent atrocities, but could also expose them to retaliation that would extend far beyond their own persons, to encompass everyone they cared about. Sirius's assignments often involved reconnecting with estranged family members and former schoolmates whose pure blood connections provided access to Death Eater social networks that were otherwise impenetrable to Order surveillance. These missions required him to partially rehabilitate relationships he had deliberately severed, pretending to have reconsidered his rejection of family ideology, while actually gathering intelligence about recruitment methods and operational planning. The psychological toll of such work was severe, forcing him to interact regularly with people whose values he despised, while maintaining enough credibility to remain useful as a source of information. The capture of Benji Fenwick marked a turning point in the Order's understanding of the enemy they faced and the methods required to combat such ruthless opposition effectively. Fenwick had been one of their most promising young operatives, a brilliant wizard whose intelligence-gathering abilities had provided crucial insights into Death Eater organizational structure and operational planning. His torture and eventual murder demonstrated that capture by Voldemort's forces meant not just death but prolonged agony designed to extract every piece of useful information before finally granting the release that victims would desperately crave long before it arrived. The psychological impact of Fenwick's loss rippled through Order ranks in ways that intelligence briefings and tactical discussions had never fully prepared them for, forcing every member to confront the reality that their commitment might require them to endure unimaginable suffering without breaking under pressure that was specifically designed to destroy both body and mind. The magical techniques employed by Death Eater interrogators went far beyond simple torture to include mental manipulation that could rewrite memories, alter personalities, and extract information from subjects who believed they were successfully resisting their captors' efforts. Marlene McKinnon's recruitment brought to the Order someone whose pure magical power was matched only by her absolute commitment to protecting innocent life regardless of personal cost. Her abilities in combat magic were legendary, even among her Hogwarts contemporaries, while her tactical instincts made her invaluable for operations that required split-second decisions under extreme pressure. But perhaps her most important contribution was philosophical, demonstrating through personal example that maintaining moral clarity was possible even when employing methods that peacetime ethics would condemn, that protecting innocence sometimes required protectors to accept the corruption of their own souls as a necessary price for keeping others safe. The McKinnon family's subsequent massacre served as a brutal reminder of the consequences that Order membership could bring to those who had never chosen to participate in the struggle, but whose relationship to active members made them targets for retaliation. Marlene's parents and younger siblings were murdered, not for any actions they had taken, but simply because their deaths would cause her pain and demonstrate to other Order members the price of continued resistance. The calculated cruelty of such attacks was designed not just to eliminate specific threats, but to destroy the morale of surviving operatives who had to live with the knowledge that their choices had brought death to people they loved. The response to such attacks revealed fundamental divisions within Order leadership about the appropriate methods for combating enemies who recognized no moral boundaries and acknowledged no distinction between combatants, civilians. Some members argued for escalated retaliation that would demonstrate to Death Eaters that their own families were equally vulnerable to revenge attacks, while others insisted that maintaining moral superiority over their opponents was essential to justifying the struggle and preserving the values they claimed to be defending. These philosophical debates were conducted in safe houses and secret meetings, but their resolution would determine not just tactical approaches, but the fundamental character of the organization and its members. Fabian and Gideon Pruitt's final stand became legendary within Order circles as an example of both tactical brilliance and ultimate sacrifice, demonstrating what properly prepared and highly skilled operatives could accomplish, even when vastly outnumbered by enemies whose magical abilities were considerable, but whose overconfidence made them vulnerable to creative and desperate tactics. The brothers had been surrounded in a situation that offered no possibility of escape, but rather than surrender or attempt flight, they chose to make their deaths as costly as possible for their attackers, while buying time for civilian evacuations in the area. The intelligence gathered from the aftermath of their battle revealed tactical innovations that Death Eaters had been developing in secret, including coordinated assault techniques that allowed multiple dark wizards to combine their magical abilities in ways that created effects far beyond what any individual could achieve alone. This information proved crucial for developing countermeasures that would save numerous Order lives in future encounters, though the price paid for such knowledge was a constant reminder of how much each tactical advantage cost in terms of human suffering and loss. Peter's gradual transformation during this period was subtle but profound, reflecting the psychological pressures of warfare on someone whose sense of self-worth had always been dependent on external validation. and whose magical abilities were barely adequate for the demands being placed upon him. His assignments were typically support roles rather than frontline combat, but even these secondary positions required skills and courage that pushed him beyond his natural limitations while highlighting the gap between his capabilities and those of his more gifted friends. The constant awareness of his relative inadequacy fed resentments that he tried to suppress, but which grew stronger with each successful mission that his friends completed while he remained relegated to lesser tasks. The authorization for Order members to use unforgivable curses represented a watershed moment in the organization's evolution from idealistic resistance movement to hardened military force capable of matching Death Eater brutality, with equally ruthless methods when circumstances demanded such approaches. The decision was not made lightly, involving extensive debates about moral philosophy and practical necessity that reflected deeper questions about the nature of justice and the prices that protecting innocents might require from their protectors. Some members welcomed the expanded mandate as recognition that civilized methods were inadequate against enemies who respected no civilized constraints, while others worried that employing such techniques would ultimately corrupt the Order's fundamental mission and transform its members into the very things they claimed to oppose. James's first use of the killing curse came during a raid on a Death Eater safe house where captured Muggle families were being held for experimental purposes that violated every principle of magical ethics and human decency. The choice to employ lethal force was made in milliseconds as he witnessed preparations for rituals that would have resulted in prolonged torture and eventual death for innocent victims, whose only crime was being born without magical abilities. The green light that erupted from his wand felt like a violation of everything he had been taught about the sanctity of life, but it also prevented suffering that would have been immeasurably worse than the quick death it delivered to someone who had forfeited any claim to mercy through his willing participation in unforgivable crimes. The psychological aftermath of such actions created burdens that Order members carried in isolation, unable to discuss their experiences with family members or friends who hadn't made similar choices and couldn't understand the moral complexities involved in killing for the greater good. Support networks within the organization provided some relief, but the fundamental loneliness of moral compromise remained a constant challenge that some members handled better than others. Those who adapted most successfully to the psychological demands of warfare often paid prices in their ability to maintain normal human relationships, becoming increasingly isolated from the very people they had committed to protecting. Lily's development of protective magic during this period would later prove crucial to Harry's survival, though at the time she was simply exploring theoretical applications of ancient magical principles that most contemporary wizards considered obsolete or impractical. Her research into blood-based protection spells was motivated by growing awareness that conventional defensive magic was proving inadequate against the innovative attack methods that Death Eaters were developing, while her Muggle-born perspective allowed her to approach traditional magical theory without the preconceptions that limited pure-blood wizards' thinking. The spells she crafted required sacrifice that went beyond simple magical energy expenditure to encompass fundamental aspects of identity and autonomy, creating protections that were literally powered by love in its most selfless form. Remus's missions often involved infiltrating werewolf communities that Fenrir Greyback was recruiting for Voldemort's cause, requiring him to pose as someone sympathetic to their grievances against magical society while actually working to prevent their transformation into instruments of terror and revenge. The moral complexity of such assignments was enormous, as many of the werewolves being recruited had legitimate reasons for resenting their treatment by mainstream magical society, while their desperation for acceptance and belonging made them vulnerable to manipulation by those who promised them power and recognition. in exchange for service to a cause that would ultimately destroy everything they claimed to value. The intelligence he gathered during these missions revealed the scope of Voldemort's recruitment efforts among magical society's marginalized populations, including not just werewolves but giants, house elves, and even some groups of centaurs who had been promised autonomy and territory in exchange for military support. This information was crucial for developing counter-propaganda efforts and alternative support networks that could address legitimate grievances without requiring alignment with genocidal ideology, though the resources required for such comprehensive approaches often exceeded what the Order could provide while maintaining its primary mission focus. Sirius's growing reputation as a duelist during this period reflected not just natural talent, but the kind of desperate innovation that warfare demanded from those who wanted to survive encounters with enemies whose training and experience often exceeded their own. His development of combat techniques that combined traditional magical methods with animagus transformation created tactical advantages that Death Eaters found difficult to counter, while his willingness to take enormous risks often turned apparently hopeless situations into Order victories through sheer audacity and creative application of unconventional approaches. But perhaps his most significant contribution was intelligence gathering that revealed the extent to which pure-blood families were financing and supporting Voldemort's operations, often through seemingly legitimate business transactions that provided the Death Eater organization with resources that far exceeded what simple criminal enterprise could generate. This information allowed the Order to target enemy financial networks and supply chains, disrupting operations through economic warfare that was less dramatic than direct combat but equally effective in degrading enemy capabilities over time. The year 1979 brought with it an escalation in both the scope and intensity of the conflict, as Voldemort's confidence in his ultimate victory led to increasingly bold attacks on targets that had previously been considered too well protected or politically sensitive to assault directly. The massacre of entire Muggle villages served both strategic and psychological purposes, eliminating witnesses to Death Eater activities while demonstrating to the magical community that their government's assurances of protection were meaningless against enemies who could strike anywhere without warning and disappear before official response forces could arrive. Order operations during this period evolved to match the enemy's escalation, with missions that required deeper penetration of Death Eater networks and more extensive use of methods that pushed the boundaries of legal and ethical constraints. The intelligence gathered through such operations revealed planning for attacks that would have resulted in casualties measured in thousands rather than dozens, while infiltration of enemy command structures provided opportunities to disrupt coordination and create internal conflicts that degraded operational effectiveness without requiring direct military confrontation. The personal costs of such intensive operations were reflected in changed relationships among Order members, as the psychological pressures of warfare created strains that even the strongest friendships sometimes couldn't bear. Trust became a precious commodity that had to be rationed carefully, while the constant awareness of potential betrayal made genuine intimacy increasingly difficult to maintain even with people who had proven their loyalty through repeated demonstration of courage and commitment. The organization that had begun as an extension of existing relationships gradually transformed into something more professional and impersonal, bound together by shared mission rather than personal affection. James and Lily's marriage during this period represented both personal happiness and tactical vulnerability, creating a relationship that provided emotional support essential for maintaining sanity under extreme pressure, while also generating additional security concerns that complicated their operational planning. Their love for each other became both strength and weakness, motivating extraordinary courage while creating potential leverage that enemies could exploit through threats and actual attacks on their shared welfare. The protective magic that Lily was developing gained new urgency as their relationship deepened, though neither of them could foresee how crucial such preparations would prove to be. As 1979 drew to a close and the First Wizarding War approached its most deadly phase, the Order of the Phoenix had evolved from a small group of concerned individuals into something approaching a shadow government, complete with intelligence networks that rivaled those of established magical institutions, military capabilities that could challenge Death Eater operations directly, and philosophical frameworks that sustained operations, requiring moral flexibility that few of its original members had imagined they would ever need to develop. The young idealists who had joined the organization to fight evil had become hardened operatives whose effectiveness was measured in enemies eliminated and innocent lives preserved, though the prices they paid for such effectiveness would mark them forever as people apart from the society they had committed their lives to protecting. The winter of 1979 brought with it a peculiar mixture of hope and foreboding that seemed to permeate the very air around number 12 Grimmauld Place, where Order members gathered in the shadow-filled drawing room to share intelligence that ranged from encouraging to terrifying in its implications. The war that had consumed their lives for nearly a decade was reaching a crescendo that none of them could have predicted, with victories and defeats occurring in rapid succession that left even the most experienced operatives struggling to understand the larger patterns emerging from seemingly random events. James Potter stood before the ancient fireplace, his arm around Lily's shoulders, in a gesture that had become unconscious over the months since their wedding, while firelight danced across faces that bore the accumulated scars of too many battles fought in shadows, where heroes received no recognition and defeats were measured in innocent lives, lost rather than territory surrendered. At 23, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced death repeatedly and emerged victorious. But there was also a new quality in his bearing, a protective tenderness that spoke of responsibilities that extended beyond personal survival, or even the Order's mission to encompass something infinitely precious that required safeguarding above all other considerations. The announcement of Lily's pregnancy had been met with reactions that perfectly encapsulated the complex emotions that defined their wartime existence. Joy at the prospect of new life and hope for the future, mingled with terror at the vulnerability that such happiness created in a world where enemies specifically targeted what their opponents held most dear. The celebration that followed the news was subdued by necessity, conducted in safe houses with detection charms active and escape routes planned, because even moments of pure happiness had to be experienced within the context of constant vigilance that had become second nature to all of them. Lily's condition during those early months was complicated by magical phenomena that none of the standard texts addressed adequately, as pregnancy, in wartime witches, often triggered protective instincts that manifested as enhanced magical abilities, specifically designed to shield developing children from external threats. Her research into protective magic had taken on new urgency and focus, driven by maternal impulses that were literally reshaping her magical core to prioritize defensive capabilities over the more balanced approach that had characterized her academic work. The spells she was developing required theoretical understanding that pushed the boundaries of contemporary magical knowledge, while demanding emotional commitment that went far beyond anything she had previously experienced. The baby's development was monitored not just by medical professionals, but by Order members whose expertise in defensive magic made them uniquely qualified to assess the protective enchantments that were apparently forming around the child even before birth. These naturally occurring shields were unprecedented in their complexity and strength, suggesting that the combination of Lily's research and her maternal instincts was creating something that transcended normal magical protection to approach the kind of ancient magic that most contemporary wizards considered purely theoretical. The implications were staggering, though none of them could foresee how crucial such protection would prove to be. Harry's birth on July 31st, 1980, occurred under circumstances that required security measures typically reserved for the most sensitive order operations, with the delivery taking place in a magically concealed location, attended by healers whose loyalty had been verified through methods that left no possibility of infiltration or betrayal. The moment of his arrival into the world was marked by magical phenomena that confirmed the theoretical predictions about his natural protective abilities, spontaneous ward generation that created barriers around the delivery room, detection spells that activated in response to his cries, and most remarkably, a brief manifestation of what appeared to be phoenix fire that burned without heat, but banished every trace of dark magic from the surrounding area. The celebrations that followed were necessarily muted, conducted in safe houses where toast was drunk to the newest member of their extended family. While detection devices remained active and guards maintained their posts outside doors, warded against intrusion by enemies who would certainly view the child's existence as both opportunity and threat. James's pride in his son was matched only by his terror at the responsibility of protecting someone so completely helpless in a world where helplessness was frequently a death sentence. While Lily's joy was tempered by awareness that her research into protective magic was no longer theoretical, but literally a matter of life and death for the person she loved most in the world. The intelligence that reached Order leadership during this period painted an increasingly complex picture of Voldemort's strategic thinking and long-term objectives, revealing planning that extended far beyond simple conquest to encompass the complete reconstruction of magical society according to principles that would have eliminated not just Muggle-born wizards, but anyone whose magical abilities or bloodline failed to meet increasingly stringent standards of purity and power. These weren't the ravings of a madman, but the carefully considered policies of someone whose vision of magical supremacy was both internally consistent and utterly terrifying in its implications for everyone who failed to qualify for inclusion in his ideal world. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of the intelligence was what it revealed about Voldemort's growing obsession with prophecies and divination, subjects that he had previously dismissed as unreliable superstition, but was now pursuing with the same methodical intensity that had characterized his earlier research into immortality and magical enhancement. Sources within Death Eater ranks reported unprecedented interest in seers and prophetic artifacts, while captured documents revealed systematic attempts to catalogue and interpret every prophetic utterance recorded in the past century, searching for patterns that might reveal weaknesses in his enemies or opportunities for decisive action that conventional strategic planning had failed to identify. The Hog's Head Inn in Hogsmeade had always been a place where unusual conversations took place. Its dingy atmosphere and disreputable clientele making it ideal for meetings that couldn't occur in more respectable establishments without attracting unwanted attention from ministry officials or social observers whose curiosity might prove dangerous to those seeking discretion. It was here, on a grey autumn afternoon when rain drummed against diamond-paned windows and the fire struggled against drafts that seemed to carry whispers of approaching winter, that one of the most significant events in magical history began to unfold through circumstances that appeared entirely mundane to casual observation. Sybil Trelawney's arrival at the inn represented the culmination of months of increasingly desperate attempts to secure employment that would allow her to use the limited divination abilities she had inherited from her famous ancestor, while providing the financial security that her impoverished circumstances required. At 22, she possessed neither the practical skills that most employers sought, nor the social connections that might have opened doors through influence rather than merit, leaving her dependent on a magical talent that was unpredictable at best and completely absent at worst, manifesting only during moments of genuine trance that she couldn't consciously control or summon at will. Her interview with Dumbledore was intended to be a formality, a courtesy extended to someone whose family name carried historical significance, despite her obvious lack of the abilities that would justify employment at Hogwarts or any other respectable institution. The headmaster's decision to meet with her at all reflected his awareness of her lineage and his respect for her ancestor's genuine gift. But his expectations were minimal, and his intention was to decline her application as gently as possible, while perhaps offering assistance in finding alternative employment that might better suit her limited qualifications and unstable temperament. The conversation that preceded the prophecy was unremarkable in every respect, covering the standard topics that such interviews required while revealing nothing that suggested exceptional ability or insight on the applicant's part. Trelawney's responses to questions about divination theory were adequate but unoriginal, demonstrating familiarity with established texts without showing the kind of innovative thinking that marked truly gifted practitioners. Her practical demonstrations were similarly disappointing, producing predictions that were either so vague as to be meaningless or so specific as to be obviously fabricated to impress someone whose knowledge of divination far exceeded her own. It was as Dumbledore prepared to conclude the interview with polite but firm rejection that the transformation occurred, so suddenly and completely that the aging wizard barely had time to recognize what was happening before. The young woman before him was no longer Sybil Trelawney, but something else entirely. A vessel through which forces beyond normal human comprehension chose to communicate information that would reshape the destiny of everyone involved in the growing conflict between light and darkness. Her voice, when the prophecy began, carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal hearing, while her eyes reflected depths that contained visions of possible futures that mortal minds weren't designed to process directly. The words that emerged from her transformed consciousness carried the weight of absolute truth, delivered through means that transcended normal magical communication, each syllable precisely chosen to convey information that was both specific enough to provide actionable intelligence and ambiguous enough to allow for multiple interpretations that would influence the choices of everyone who heard. To them, the prophecy spoke of power sufficient to vanquish the Dark Lord, of birth timing that would identify the chosen one, of marking that would create connection between hunter and hunted, and most ominously, of mutual destruction that would resolve the conflict through elimination of one participant or the other. Dumbledore's recognition of the prophecy's significance was immediate and complete, reflecting not just his extensive knowledge of divination theory, but his intimate understanding of Voldemort's psychology and the ways that prophetic utterances might influence someone whose arrogance was matched only by his paranoid fear of any threat to his assumed invincibility. The information contained within those fateful words was dangerous beyond measure, capable of setting in motion events that could either save the wizarding world or ensure its destruction, depending on how various participants chose to respond to knowledge that revealed possible futures, while remaining silent about the opaque actions that might bring those possibilities into reality. The presence of Severus Snape in the Hog's Head that evening was not coincidental. though the full scope of his mission and the identity of his ultimate loyalties would remain hidden for years to come. His position as a Death Eater spy had provided him with access to intelligence about Dumbledore's activities that included the headmaster's appointment with a potential divination professor, while his personal interest in anything that might affect Lily Evans Potter made him particularly attentive to conversations that might have implications for her safety and welfare. The decision to position himself where he might overhear private conversations represented a calculated risk that reflected both professional obligation and personal obsession in measures that even he couldn't clearly distinguish. The portion of the prophecy that Snape managed to hear before discovery and ejection from the premises was carefully chosen by fate to include the most dangerous information while omitting the crucial details that might have allowed for more nuanced interpretation of its meaning and implications. He learned of the Chosen One's birth timing and parentage, of the power that would prove capable of destroying his master, and most significantly, of the connection between Voldemort's downfall and the survival of someone whose identity could be determined through analysis of the prophecy's specific requirements. What he missed were the warnings about marking and mutual destruction that might have influenced his subsequent actions and recommendations. His report to Voldemort was delivered with the efficiency that had made him valuable to the Death Eater organization, though the emotional turmoil beneath his professional composure remained carefully hidden from someone whose expertise in reading psychological states made deception extraordinarily dangerous for anyone foolish enough to attempt it. The Dark Lord's reaction to the prophetic intelligence was immediate and intense, reflecting the combination of arrogance and insecurity that had driven his rise to power while creating vulnerabilities that more confident leaders might not have possessed. The suggestion that someone capable of destroying him might already exist was intolerable to someone whose entire identity was built on assumptions of superiority and invincibility. The analysis that followed consumed weeks of intensive research, as Voldemort's most trusted followers scoured genealogical records and intelligence files to identify potential candidates whose circumstances matched the prophecy's requirements, while the Dark Lord himself delved into theoretical texts on divination and fate that he had previously dismissed as irrelevant to someone of his capabilities and ambitions. The process revealed obsessive tendencies that had been developing for years but were now focused on a specific threat that seemed to challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying his entire worldview and strategic planning. The identification of Harry Potter and Neville Longbottom as the only children whose birth timing and family histories matched the prophecy's specifications created a dilemma that required resolution through analysis of factors that went beyond simple elimination of potential threats to encompass questions of symbolic significance and personal psychology that revealed more about Voldemort's character than about the prophecy's true meaning. Both families had defied him multiple times. Both children were born at the specified time, but the choice between them would be influenced by considerations that reflected the Dark Lord's own background and beliefs about the nature of worthiness and destiny. Harry Potter's mixed blood heritage resonated with Voldemort's personal history in ways that made him a more psychologically compelling target than Neville Longbottom, whose pure blood status and family connections to the Sacred 28 should theoretically have made him a more dangerous enemy, but actually reduced his symbolic significance for someone whose own Muggle ancestry had been a source of shame and rage throughout his transformation from Tom Riddle into the Dark Lord. The prophecy's reference to marking suggested that the Chosen One would somehow reflect or mirror his own nature, making Harry's half-blood status appear to fulfill requirements that Neville's pure magical lineage could not satisfy. The decision to target the Potter family created immediate tactical challenges that required careful planning and resource allocation, as both James and Lily had proven themselves formidable opponents, whose magical abilities and order connections made direct assault extremely dangerous, even for someone of Voldemort's capabilities. Their previous encounters had demonstrated their skill and determination while revealing protective magic that exceeded anything typically employed by wizards their age, suggesting preparation and knowledge that went beyond standard magical education to encompass techniques that were either highly advanced or completely innovative in their application and effectiveness. Snape's horrified realization of what his intelligence report had set in motion came too late to prevent Voldemort's decision, but early enough to potentially influence its implementation, creating moral crisis that forced him to confront the ultimate consequences of his divided loyalties and conflicted motivations. The woman he had loved since childhood was now targeted for elimination, not because of any action she had taken, but simply because her son's existence represented a prophetic threat to his master's continued dominance, while his own role in creating this situation made him complicit in events that could result in her death and the destruction of the only relationship that had ever given meaning to his otherwise empty existence. His desperate plea to Voldemort for Lily's life represented a complete reversal of priorities that risked exposing the depth of his personal attachments, while demonstrating willingness to sacrifice everything else he claimed to value for the preservation of someone who had never returned his feelings and probably never even suspected their existence. The Dark Lord's agreement to spare her life was motivated less by loyalty to a valuable servant than by curiosity about the emotional weaknesses that could make someone as useful as Snape vulnerable to such obvious manipulation, while his private amusement at the request revealed contempt for human connections that he viewed as exploitable flaws rather than sources of strength. But even as he secured this hollow promise, Snape understood that Voldemort's word was worthless when circumstances made mercy inconvenient, while Lily's own character made it impossible that she would stand aside while her child was murdered, regardless of what guarantees might have been given for her personal safety. The knowledge that his efforts to protect her were probably doomed to failure drove him to consider alternatives that would have been unthinkable months earlier, when his loyalty to the Death Eater cause had seemed absolute, and his future had appeared to lie entirely within the organization that had given him power and recognition that the legitimate wizarding world had never offered. The decision to approach Dumbledore represented not just betrayal of his Death Eater associates, but complete transformation of his fundamental identity and allegiances, abandoning everything he had worked to achieve in service of someone who had never asked for his protection and might never even know that he had sacrificed everything to secure her survival. The meeting took place in the headmaster's office, under circumstances that required elaborate precautions to prevent discovery by either Order members who would certainly question his motives, or Death Eaters whose suspicions would mean immediate death for someone whose treachery would be considered the worst possible form of betrayal. Dumbledore's reaction to Snape's desperate request was complex and calculating, reflecting recognition of both the genuine remorse that motivated the approach and the strategic opportunities that such a conversion might create for Order operations that had been hampered by lack of intelligence about Voldemort's inner circle and decision-making processes. The negotiation that followed was conducted with the understanding that trust was impossible, but cooperation might be mutually beneficial, creating an arrangement that served both parties' interests while leaving fundamental questions about loyalty and motivation unresolved in ways that would complicate their relationship for decades to come. The terms of Snape's defection were straightforward in concept, but extraordinarily dangerous in implementation, requiring him to maintain his Death Eater cover while providing intelligence to the Order and actively working to undermine operations that might threaten Lily's safety or the broader mission of protecting innocent lives from Voldemort's genocidal ambitions. The psychological strain of such double agency was enormous, demanding compartmentalization skills that few people possessed while creating moral conflicts that had no clear resolution through conventional ethical frameworks that assumed basic honesty in human relationships. His integration into Order operations was accomplished gradually and with extensive security precautions that reflected both the value of his potential contributions and the dangers that his presence created for an organization whose effectiveness depended on trust and cooperation among members, whose backgrounds and motivations varied widely. The intelligence he provided proved invaluable for understanding Death Eater, planning and preventing attacks on civilian targets, while his insights into Voldemort's psychology helped Order leadership develop strategies that exploited the Dark Lord's weaknesses and blind spots in ways that conventional military thinking could never have achieved. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Snape's conversion was what it revealed about the power of love to transform even the most apparently irredeemable characters, demonstrating that genuine emotional connection could motivate changes that external pressure or rational argument had failed to produce. His willingness to risk everything for someone who didn't return his feelings and might never know about his sacrifice represented the kind of selfless devotion that Voldemort's philosophy claimed was weakness, but which actually proved to be a source of strength that the Dark Lord couldn't understand or counter effectively. The magical protections that Lily was developing during this period gained new urgency and focus as the prophetic threat to her family became clear, though the specific applications she was researching would have seemed theoretical to anyone who hadn't understood the connections between ancient magical principles and the practical requirements of protecting loved ones from enemies, whose power exceeded anything that conventional defensive spells could withstand. Her work combined scholarly research into historical texts with innovative experimentation that pushed the boundaries of what individual wizards could safely attempt, creating magical effects that were literally powered by emotional commitment rather than simple magical energy. The theory underlying her protective magic was based on recognition that the most powerful magical effects required sacrifice that went beyond temporary inconvenience or even significant pain to encompass fundamental aspects of identity and autonomy that most wizards would never willingly surrender. The spells she was crafting would create barriers that were sustained not by the caster's magical core, but by the depth of their love for those being protected, drawing power from emotional connections that were strong enough to transcend death itself while creating protections that would endure as long as those connections remained intact. James's role in developing these protections was both practical and emotional, providing magical energy and theoretical insights, while serving as the focal point for protective instincts that were reshaping Lily's entire approach to magic in ways that prioritized defense over offense and love over power in all its applications. His own magical abilities were being enhanced through exposure to the innovative techniques she was developing, creating synergistic effects that made their combined magical signature something unprecedented in contemporary wizarding practice, while preparing them for confrontations that would require resources far beyond what either could have provided individually. The birth of their son had created magical connections that extended the protective enchantments to encompass a third person whose helplessness made him simultaneously the most vulnerable member of their family and the most important recipient of whatever safeguards they could provide through theoretical knowledge combined with parental devotion that literally reshaped the magical environment around him. Harry's presence in their lives had transformed abstract research into urgent practical necessity, while his natural magical abilities were apparently being enhanced by exposure to protective magic that was far more advanced than anything typically encountered by developing wizards. As 1980 progressed and intelligence reports painted increasingly grim pictures of Voldemort's growing power and expanding ambitions, the Potter family found themselves at the center of events that would determine not just their own survival, but the ultimate outcome of a conflict that had consumed the wizarding world for over a decade. The prophecy that had identified their son as the Chosen One had also marked them for elimination by enemies whose ruthlessness was matched only by their magical abilities, while the protective magic that Lily was developing represented their only hope of survival against opponents whose power exceeded anything that conventional magical education had prepared them to face. The knowledge that they were living on borrowed time created a strange mixture of urgency and resignation that characterized their final months together, as they worked frantically to complete magical preparations that might prove inadequate while trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life for their son's benefit and their own psychological stability. Every day brought new intelligence about Death Eater activities and Voldemort's growing obsession with the prophecy, while every night was spent refining protective spells and contingency plans that might allow Harry to survive even if his parents could not. The love that bound them together had become both their greatest strength and their most dangerous vulnerability, creating magical effects that exceeded anything in recorded history, while painting targets on their backs that made them priorities for elimination by enemies who understood that destroying their family unit would eliminate the prophetic threat, while demonstrating to other Order members the futility of opposing Voldemort's will. The stage was being set for confrontation that would test every assumption about the nature of magical power and the strength of human connections, with stakes that extended far beyond individual survival to encompass the future of magical civilization itself. In the quiet moments between crises, when they held their sleeping son and felt the protective magic that surrounded him like a warm embrace, James and Lily Potter understood that they were living through the final chapter of a story that had begun with prophecy and would end with sacrifice, though neither could foresee the exact form that sacrifice would take, or the miraculous consequences that their love would create in the darkness that was rapidly approaching their sanctuary. The autumn rain that fell upon the grounds of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry seemed to carry with it whispers of change that penetrated even the ancient stones of the castle, as if the very elements understood that momentous events were unfolding within those hallowed halls where generations of young witches and wizards had learned to wield magic, both light and dark. In the circular office at the top of the tallest tower, Albus Dumbledore sat behind his mahogany desk, his blue eyes reflecting depths of sorrow and calculation that spoke of decisions no human being should ever be required to make, while before him stood a young man whose desperation was so profound that it seemed to emanate from him like heat from a forge. Severus Snape's journey to this moment had been marked by choices that had led him down increasingly dark paths, each decision seeming reasonable at the time but combining to create a trajectory that had brought him to the service of the most evil wizard in recorded history. His recruitment by Death Eater agents during his final years at Hogwarts had been accomplished through a combination of ideological seduction and personal validation that had filled voids in his psyche created by years of abuse, neglect, and social isolation. The promise of power and recognition within Voldemort's organization had seemed to offer everything that the legitimate wizarding world had denied him, while the dark arts training he received provided outlets for anger and resentment that had been festering since childhood. But the years of service to Voldemort's cause had gradually revealed truths about the Death Eater ideology and its practical implementation that challenged everything Snape had believed about what he was helping to create. The systematic elimination of Muggle-born wizards was not the surgical removal of inferior elements that Death Eater propaganda claimed, but genocidal brutality that targeted entire families, including children whose only crime was being born to the wrong parents. The pure blood supremacy that had been presented as natural hierarchy was revealed as arbitrary cruelty that served no purpose beyond satisfying the sadistic impulses of those who wielded power without wisdom or restraint. Most disturbing of all was the growing realization that his own status within the organization was based not on genuine respect for his abilities or contributions, but on his usefulness as a tool that could be discarded without consideration once his purpose was served. The Death Eaters, who claimed to value his intelligence and magical skills, treated him with barely concealed contempt that reflected their true opinion of anyone whose blood was not pure enough to meet their increasingly stringent standards, while Voldemort himself viewed all his followers as expendable resources whose lives had value only insofar as they advanced his personal ambitions. The prophecy that he had overheard at the Hog's Head Inn had initially seemed like an opportunity to demonstrate his worth through the delivery of intelligence that his master would certainly find valuable. But the implications of what he had learned became clear only as Voldemort's response to the information revealed the Dark Lord's intentions regarding the families that might be harboring the prophesied child. The systematic analysis of potential targets had proceeded with mechanical efficiency that treated human lives as mathematical variables to be manipulated or eliminated based purely on strategic calculations that acknowledged no moral constraints or humanitarian considerations. When the Potter family emerged as Voldemort's chosen target, Snape's world collapsed with devastating completeness, as he understood that his intelligence report had effectively signed a death warrant for the only person who had ever shown him genuine kindness during his formative years at Hogwarts. Lily Evans Potter had been his first and perhaps only real friend, someone whose compassion had penetrated his defensive barriers. Despite the vast differences in their backgrounds and social circumstances, her marriage to James Potter had ended any possibility of romantic relationship, but it had not diminished his feelings for her or his gratitude for moments of human connection that had provided light during the darkest periods of his adolescence. The knowledge that his actions would lead to her murder created psychological crisis that forced him to confront fundamental questions about identity and values that he had avoided addressing throughout his adult life. The path he had chosen in service to Voldemort had been justified through elaborate rationalizations about the necessity of radical change and the weakness of existing magical institutions. But when those abstract justifications led to concrete consequences for someone he loved, the entire framework of beliefs that had sustained his Death Eater loyalty crumbled like sandcastles before an incoming tide. His desperate plea to Voldemort for Lily's life had been motivated by emotions that he barely understood and certainly couldn't control, revealing vulnerabilities that made him valuable to his master in entirely new ways, while demonstrating the extent to which personal attachments could compromise even the most seemingly dedicated followers. The Dark Lord's agreement to spare her was delivered with casual indifference that made clear his contempt for such weakness, while his private amusement at the request revealed understanding of psychological leverage that could be exploited to ensure continued obedience through emotional manipulation, rather than simple fear of physical consequences. But even as he secured this hollow promise, Snape recognized that circumstances would almost certainly make its fulfillment impossible, as Lily's character made it inconceivable that she would stand aside while her child was murdered regardless of what guarantees might have been given for her personal safety. The protective instincts that had made her defend outcast students during their school years would certainly compel her to fight to the death for her son. While her magical abilities and order training meant that such resistance would pose genuine threats to whoever was tasked with carrying out Voldemort's orders, the promise to spare her life was meaningless when the mission's success would require her elimination, along with the rest of her family. The realization that conventional Death Eater channels offered no real hope of protecting Lily forced Snape to consider alternatives that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier, when his loyalty to Voldemort's cause had seemed absolute, and his future had appeared to lie entirely within the organization that had provided him with power and recognition that the legitimate wizarding world had never offered. The prospect of betraying everything he had worked for over the past several years was terrifying, not just because of the physical dangers it would entail, but because it would require admitting that his fundamental judgment had been catastrophically wrong about matters that he had considered central to his identity and purpose. The decision to approach Dumbledore represented complete transformation of allegiances that went far beyond simple tactical considerations to encompass acknowledgement that his entire worldview had been based on misconceptions and self-deceptions that had led him to serve evil, while convincing himself that he was working for necessary change. The approach had to be conducted with extraordinary secrecy to avoid detection by Death Eater surveillance networks that monitored their members' activities for signs of disloyalty, while the meeting itself required courage that exceeded anything demanded by his previous assignments. Since discovery would mean not just death, but prolonged torture designed to extract every piece of information he possessed about order, operations, and personnel. The walk through Hogwarts corridors toward the headmaster's office felt like a journey through his own past, as familiar surroundings triggered memories of the young man he had been before ideology and ambition had led him down paths that had corrupted everything he had once valued about knowledge and magical achievement. The portraits that watched his passage seemed to judge him with eyes that had witnessed generations of students grapple with moral choices, while the very stones beneath his feet felt weighted with the accumulated wisdom of centuries that had seen countless individuals face moments when their fundamental character was tested through circumstances that admitted no compromise or delay. Dumbledore's office, when he finally reached it, was exactly as he remembered from his student years, filled with whirring instruments and sleeping portraits that created an atmosphere of ancient power, tempered by scholarly curiosity and genuine care for the welfare of those who sought guidance or assistance. The headmaster himself appeared aged by the years that had passed since their last meeting, his beard whiter and his face more lined, but his blue eyes retained the penetrating intelligence that had made him both feared by enemies and trusted by those who shared his commitment to protecting innocent life regardless of personal cost. The conversation that followed was unlike anything in Snape's previous experience, as he found himself stripped of the defensive mechanisms that had protected him from emotional vulnerability throughout his adult life. Dumbledore's responses to his desperate pleas were measured and analytical, reflecting recognition of both the genuine remorse that motivated his approach and the strategic opportunities that such a conversion might create for order operations that had been hampered by lack of reliable intelligence about Voldemort's inner circle and decision-making processes. But beneath the tactical calculations lay something more profound: acknowledgement of the human capacity for redemption, even in cases where moral failure had seemed complete and irreversible. Dumbledore had encountered Tom Riddle during his transformation into Voldemort, and understood better than most how promising individuals could be corrupted by circumstances and choices that seemed reasonable at the time but led inexorably toward evil. While his decades of experience with students who had made serious mistakes had taught him to recognize genuine repentance when it was offered with complete sincerity and at enormous personal cost. The terms of Snape's defection were negotiated with the understanding that trust was impossible but cooperation might serve both parties' interests, while advancing the larger cause of protecting innocent lives from genocidal violence that acknowledged no moral boundaries or humanitarian constraints. The arrangement that emerged was complex and dangerous, requiring Snape to maintain his Death Eater cover, while providing intelligence to the Order and actively working to undermine operations that threatened civilian targets or Order personnel. The psychological strain would be enormous, demanding compartmentalization skills that few people possessed while creating moral conflicts that had no clear resolution through conventional ethical frameworks. The specific intelligence he could provide was invaluable beyond measure, as his position within Voldemort's organization gave him access to strategic planning and operational details that no other source could supply. His insights into the Dark Lord's psychology and decision-making processes would allow Order leadership to predict enemy actions and develop countermeasures that exploited weaknesses and blind spots that conventional military analysis could never have identified. But perhaps most importantly, his presence within Death Eater ranks would provide early warning of threats to specific targets, while creating opportunities for sabotage that could save lives without revealing the existence of an intelligence source whose compromise would mean immediate death. The magical binding that sealed their agreement was unlike anything in standard wizarding contracts, incorporating elements of unbreakable vows while allowing for flexibility in implementation that acknowledged the impossibility of predicting every circumstance that might arise during extended covert operations. The spell work required was enormously complex, creating obligations that were enforced through magical compulsion while preserving enough autonomy to allow for tactical decisions that circumstances might demand. The process itself was painful and potentially dangerous, as the magic involved in binding such conflicted loyalties pushed the boundaries of what individual wizards could safely endure. But even as the binding was completed and their partnership formally established, both men understood that they were embarking on a relationship that would be characterized by mutual suspicion and careful testing rather than genuine trust or personal affection. Dumbledore's acceptance of Snape's conversion was based on tactical necessity rather than belief in his fundamental reform, while Snape's commitment to the Order was motivated by desperate love for someone who would never know about his sacrifice, rather than abstract dedication to principles of justice or humanitarian concern for victims of Death Eater violence. The practical challenges of maintaining dual loyalties while operating under constant surveillance from associates whose suspicions would mean immediate death created psychological pressures that few human beings could sustain without significant mental and emotional damage. Snape would be required to participate in activities that violated every moral principle he claimed to have adopted while gathering intelligence that might prevent even worse atrocities from occurring, walking a razor's edge between maintaining cover and preserving enough humanity to function effectively as a double agent working for the forces of light. His first assignment as an Order asset involved subtly influencing Death Eater tactical planning in ways that would create opportunities for Order intervention without revealing the existence of an intelligence source within Voldemort's inner circle. This required understanding of group dynamics and psychological manipulation that went far beyond anything his magical education had covered, while the emotional cost of appearing to support actions he was secretly working to undermine created internal conflicts that threatened his sanity and effectiveness in equal measure. The intelligence he provided during his first months as a double agent proved invaluable for Order operations, allowing them to prevent attacks on civilian targets while capturing or eliminating Death Eaters whose activities had been identified through information that no other source could have supplied. His insights into Voldemort's strategic thinking enabled Order leadership to understand the scope and timeline of planned operations while developing countermeasures that exploited the Dark Lord's psychological weaknesses and tactical blind spots. But the most significant contribution he made during this period was not tactical intelligence, but psychological analysis that revealed the extent to which Voldemort's obsession with the prophecy was affecting his decision-making, processes, and strategic priorities. The Dark Lord's growing paranoia about potential threats to his assumed invincibility was creating opportunities for Order operations, while also increasing the dangers faced by anyone identified as connected to the prophesied child, making protection of the Potter family an increasingly complex challenge that required resources and capabilities that the Order was struggling to provide. The protective magic that Lily Potter was developing gained new urgency as intelligence from Snape confirmed that Voldemort's plans for eliminating the prophetic threat were becoming increasingly specific and imminent. Her research into ancient magical principles was being guided by theoretical knowledge that few contemporary wizards possessed, but the practical applications required emotional commitment and personal sacrifice that went far beyond anything typically demanded by even the most advanced magical techniques. The spells she was crafting would literally be powered by love rather than magical energy, drawing strength from emotional connections that were strong enough to transcend death itself. Snape's knowledge of these protective enchantments came through his access to Death Eater intelligence gathering, rather than direct involvement in their development, as his cover required maintaining distance from Order operations, while appearing to support efforts to penetrate their security and identify their personnel. This created the paradoxical situation where he was simultaneously working to protect Lily while being required to participate in planning for her elimination, walking an impossible line between competing loyalties that threatened to destroy him regardless of which side ultimately proved victorious in their conflict. The psychological toll of such extended deception was evident to anyone who knew him well enough to notice the subtle changes in behavior and demeanor that marked someone operating under extreme stress over extended periods. His natural antisocial tendencies became more pronounced as the strain of maintaining false personas with multiple audiences exhausted his capacity for normal human interaction, while his academic interests shifted towards subjects that provided escape from immediate pressures through intellectual challenges that had no connection to the moral complexities that defined his daily existence. But perhaps the most profound change was in his relationship with magic itself, as the techniques required for successful espionage and the protective spells he was secretly developing for Order use pushed him toward understanding of magical principles that transcended simple spellcasting to encompass fundamental forces that governed the interaction between conscious intention and reality itself. His abilities as a potioneer were enhanced through this deeper comprehension, while his defensive magic gained subtlety and power that reflected integration of theoretical knowledge with practical necessity that few wizards ever achieved. The months that followed his conversion were marked by a series of successful Order operations that relied heavily on intelligence he provided, though the security requirements that protected his cover meant that most Order members remained unaware of the source of their tactical advantages. His warnings prevented massacres that would have claimed hundreds of innocent lives, while his sabotage efforts disrupted Death Eater supply chains and communication networks in ways that appeared to be the result of internal conflicts rather than external interference. But each success came at enormous personal cost, as he was forced to witness atrocities that his intelligence could not prevent while maintaining the facade of enthusiasm for activities that violated everything he had come to believe about right and wrong. The moral compromises required for effective double agency created psychological damage that would affect him for the rest of his life. while the isolation necessary for operational security cut him off from the human connections that might have provided emotional support during the darkest periods of his service. The relationship that developed between Snape and Dumbledore during this period was complex and often adversarial, characterized by mutual respect for each other's capabilities, combined with fundamental disagreement about methods and priorities that reflected their vastly different approaches to moral philosophy and practical ethics. The headmaster's willingness to accept intelligence obtained through methods he would never personally employ created tension that was never fully resolved, while his protection of his assets sometimes conflicted with broader order objectives in ways that required difficult choices about competing priorities and acceptable costs. As 1980 progressed, and intelligence reports indicated that Voldemort's plans were approaching implementation, the question of how to protect the Potter family became increasingly urgent while remaining seemingly impossible to resolve through conventional means. The prophetic threat they represented made them targets that the Dark Lord would pursue with all available resources, while their importance to order morale and operations made their loss potentially catastrophic for resistance efforts that were already operating under enormous pressure from escalating Death Eater activities. Snape's position within the enemy organization gave him unique insights into the timeline and methods that would be employed against the Potter family, but his ability to influence those plans was limited by the need to maintain cover that was becoming increasingly difficult, as Voldemort's paranoia about potential traitors within his ranks led to enhanced security measures and more intensive surveillance of all Death Eater activities. The margin for error in his operations was shrinking rapidly, while the stakes continued to rise toward levels that would determine not just individual survival, but the ultimate outcome of the entire war. The love that had motivated his betrayal of everything he had previously believed in remained as powerful as ever, though it was now tempered by understanding of the broader implications of the conflict and his role in determining its resolution. His commitment to protecting Lily had evolved into dedication to the larger cause she represented, while his hatred of Voldemort had grown from personal resentment to principled opposition to everything the Dark Lord embodied about the corruption of power and the triumph of fear over love in human affairs. In the quiet moments between dangerous missions and tense meetings, when he allowed himself to contemplate the path that had brought him to such an impossible position, Snape understood that his redemption would be measured not in personal satisfaction or public recognition, but in the lives saved through intelligence he provided and the atrocities prevented through sabotage he conducted while maintaining a facade of loyalty to causes he had come to despise. The transformation from Death Eater to Order asset was complete, though the costs of that change would continue to accumulate for years to come, as the war entered its final and most deadly phase. The autumn of 1981 carried with it an atmosphere of desperate calm that settled over the magical world like morning mist before a storm, as families went about their daily routines while understanding that each ordinary moment might be their last, before circumstances beyond their control swept away everything they held dear. In the ancient village of Godric's Hollow, where cobblestone streets wound between cottages that had sheltered generations of witches and wizards, one particular house stood protected by magic so complex and powerful that even its existence had been hidden from those who might wish its inhabitants harm. The implementation of the Fidelius charm around the Potter family's sanctuary had required magical expertise that pushed the boundaries of what even experienced practitioners considered safely achievable, involving spell work that literally embedded secrets within living souls while creating barriers that could withstand assault from the most powerful dark wizards of the age. The choice of Godric's Hollow as their refuge had been made through careful analysis of locations that offered both historical significance and practical advantages, as the village's long association with magical families provided natural camouflage for additional protective enchantments, while its proximity to London allowed for rapid communication with Order headquarters when circumstances required coordination with broader resistance efforts. Albus Dumbledore's personal connection to the village through his childhood memories and continuing relationships with long-time residents had proven invaluable in securing the cooperation and assistance that such an ambitious concealment operation required, while his intimate knowledge of the area's magical geography allowed for protective schemes that incorporated natural ley lines and accumulated magical energies that had been building for centuries. The local magical community's willingness to participate in safeguarding the Potter family reflected not just respect for Dumbledore's leadership, but understanding that Voldemort's victory would mean the end of the tolerant and diverse magical society that places like Godric's Hollow represented. Bathilda Bagshot's role in the protection effort went far beyond simple neighborly assistance to encompass active participation in intelligence gathering and security maintenance that few people her age would have been capable of undertaking, while her reputation as a harmless elderly historian provided perfect cover for activities that were actually crucial to maintaining the Fidelius charm's effectiveness. Her extensive knowledge of magical history proved invaluable in developing protective spells that drew upon ancient techniques that contemporary wizards had forgotten or dismissed as obsolete, while her social connections throughout the village allowed for subtle monitoring of potential security threats without arousing suspicion from casual observers. The cottage that became the Potter family's final refuge was transformed through months of careful magical enhancement into something that transcended ordinary domestic space to become a fortress designed to protect its inhabitants from threats that conventional home security could never address. Every room was warded against intrusion through multiple layers of protective magic that created overlapping fields of detection and defense, while the structure itself was reinforced through spells that made its walls and foundations resistant to both magical and physical assault. The garden surrounding the house was planted with flowers and herbs, whose natural magical properties enhanced the protective enchantments, while providing early warning of approaching enemies through plant behavior that only trained observers would recognize as significant. James Potter's adaptation to life under such extraordinary security constraints revealed character depths that his previous experiences had never fully tested, as the enforced isolation challenged his naturally social personality, while the constant awareness of danger required vigilance that was exhausting to maintain over extended periods. His role as protector of his family demanded not just magical skill but psychological resilience that allowed him to remain cheerful and optimistic for Lily and Harry's benefit, while privately grappling with the knowledge that their enemies were actively planning their elimination. The transformation from carefree young man to responsible father occurred under circumstances that would have broken lesser souls. But his love for his wife and son provided strength that enabled him to bear burdens that he had never imagined would be required of him. The magical devices he developed during their hidden months reflected both his innovative talents and his desperate determination to provide every possible protection for his family, creating detection systems that could identify threats through methods that conventional security measures never addressed. His modifications to existing protective spells incorporated elements of advanced transfiguration and charms, work that produced effects far beyond what standard magical education typically covered, while his collaboration with Lily on defensive magic created synergistic combinations that exceeded what either could have achieved working alone. Lily's research into protective enchantments during this period was driven by maternal instincts that had literally reshaped her magical core to prioritize defensive capabilities over the more balanced approach that had characterized her academic work. while her theoretical understanding of ancient magical principles allowed her to develop applications that contemporary wizards considered impossible or impractical. The spells she was crafting required not just technical proficiency but emotional commitment that went far beyond anything typically demanded by even the most advanced magical techniques, drawing power from love rather than magical energy, while creating protections that would endure as long as that love remained strong. Her correspondence with friends and order members during their hidden months revealed the complex emotional landscape of someone trying to maintain normalcy under extraordinary circumstances, balancing genuine joy in her son's development with constant awareness that their peaceful domestic life existed only through magical concealment that could be shattered at any moment. The letters she wrote to Sirius carried particular poignancy as they documented Harry's first steps, first words, and daily discoveries while acknowledging the dangers that made such simple pleasures precious beyond measure. Harry's development during those crucial early months occurred within an environment saturated with protective magic that was literally powered by his parents' love for him, creating conditions that enhanced his natural magical abilities while shielding him from the dark forces that sought his destruction. His first manifestations of accidental magic were unusually powerful and consistently defensive in nature, suggesting that exposure to such concentrated protective enchantments was influencing his magical development in ways that would affect him for the rest of his life. The toy broomstick that Sirius had given him for his first birthday became a source of joy that provided brief respites from the tension that pervaded their hidden existence, while his obvious delight in magical objects and phenomena demonstrated intellectual curiosity that promised great things for his future, if that future could be secured. The domestic routines that James and Lily established during their hidden months were carefully designed to provide structure and normalcy for Harry's benefit, while accommodating the security requirements that made spontaneous activities impossible and routine errands potentially fatal. Every aspect of their daily life required planning and preparation that most families never had to consider, from obtaining food and supplies through trusted intermediaries to maintaining magical concealment that made their very existence undetectable to enemies who possessed resources and abilities far beyond those of ordinary criminals. Bathilda Bagshot's regular visits provided crucial social contact for the isolated family, while serving practical purposes that went far beyond neighborly concern, as her presence allowed for intelligence updates and supply deliveries that maintained their connection to the outside world, without compromising the security that kept them alive. Her stories about Dumbledore's youth and family history provided fascinating insights into the headmaster's background, while offering intellectual stimulation that helped combat the psychological effects of prolonged isolation, though some of her more controversial revelations raised questions about their protector's past that were troubling to contemplate during their current vulnerability. The decision regarding Secret Keeper selection represented one of the most crucial choices in magical history, though at the time it seemed like a straightforward matter of trust and tactical considerations that would determine who could reveal their location to Voldemort's forces if captured and tortured. Sirius Black's obvious qualifications for the role included not just his magical abilities and personal loyalty, but his status as Harry's godfather and his intimate knowledge of the family's routines and relationships that would make him an effective protector under any circumstances that might arise. But Sirius's strategic thinking revealed depths of tactical sophistication that his friends had not previously recognized, as his analysis of the situation led him to conclusions that challenged conventional wisdom about security and deception in warfare against enemies whose intelligence capabilities exceeded anything the Order had previously faced. His recognition that Voldemort would naturally assume that the most trusted friend would serve as Secret Keeper made such an obvious choice tactically dangerous, while his understanding of Death Eater psychology suggested that they would focus their efforts on capturing and breaking someone whose importance was immediately apparent, rather than investigating less obvious possibilities. Peter Pettigrew's selection as the actual secret keeper was motivated by logic that was both sound and ultimately catastrophic, reflecting assumptions about character and capability that would prove disastrously incorrect when tested under extreme pressure. His perceived weakness and insignificance were viewed as advantages that would make him an unlikely target for Death Eater attention, while his genuine love for his friends was considered sufficient motivation to resist any pressure that enemies might bring to bear. The psychological profile that made him seem ideal for the role also contained the seeds of his eventual betrayal, though the subtle signs of his deteriorating loyalty were missed by friends whose trust in him was based on years of shared experience rather than careful analysis of his current state of mind. The magical binding that made Peter the sole repository of information about the Potter family's location created vulnerability that was unprecedented in its scope and consequences, as the security of 3 lives and the ultimate outcome of the war against Voldemort depended entirely on one person's continued loyalty and psychological resilience. The Fidelius charm's effectiveness was absolute but also brittle, providing perfect protection as long as the secret keeper remained trustworthy but offering no safeguards against betrayal from within. While the magic involved made it impossible to transfer the secret to someone more reliable once the initial binding was complete, Peter's psychological transformation during the months leading up to his eventual betrayal was gradual but inexorable, reflecting the cumulative effect of pressures and insecurities that had been building for years, but reached critical mass only when the weight of absolute responsibility forced him to confront his deepest fears about inadequacy and worthlessness. His role as secret keeper provided the recognition and importance he had always craved, but it also highlighted his isolation from the more glamorous and dangerous work that his friends were undertaking, while he remained hidden and inactive in a safe house that felt increasingly like a prison. The intelligence reports that reached Order leadership during this period painted an increasingly grim picture of Death Eater activities and Voldemort's growing obsession with locating and eliminating the Potter family, while parallel efforts to identify and protect Neville Longbottom created additional strain on resources that were already stretched beyond their sustainable limits. The systematic hunting of families associated with the prophecy demonstrated the Dark Lord's determination to eliminate any potential threat regardless of cost, while his willingness to commit enormous resources to such efforts revealed how seriously he took the prophetic warning about his eventual defeat. Snape's intelligence from within Death Eater ranks provided crucial insights into the timeline and methods that would be employed against the Potter family, though his ability to influence enemy planning was limited by the need to maintain cover that was becoming increasingly difficult. As Voldemort's paranoia led to enhanced security measures and more intensive surveillance of all his Bayesian followers, the information he provided allowed Order leadership to understand the scope of the threat, while highlighting the inadequacy of conventional protective measures against enemies whose resources and determination exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The Safe House network that had been established to protect Order families during this period represented an unprecedented mobilization of magical resources and expertise, with properties throughout Britain being enhanced through protective enchantments that incorporated lessons learned from years of warfare against increasingly sophisticated enemies. Each location required individual assessment and customized security measures that reflected the specific threats its inhabitants might face, while coordination between sites demanded communication methods that could function despite Death Eater efforts to monitor and intercept Order intelligence. The psychological toll of extended isolation under such circumstances affected different family members in various ways, with James struggling against his naturally active temperament, while Lily found intellectual challenges in her magical research that provided outlets for energy that couldn't be expressed through normal activities. Harry's development proceeded normally in most respects, though his exposure to such concentrated protective magic was creating abilities and instincts that would serve him well in future confrontations with dark forces, while the love that surrounded him literally shaped his magical core in ways that would prove crucial during the trials that lay ahead. The celebration of Harry's first birthday was conducted under security conditions that would have been considered excessive for protecting heads of state, with guests limited to a handful of the most trusted Order members, and every aspect of the gathering planned to minimize risks while providing some semblance of normal family celebration. The joy that marked the occasion was genuine, but tempered by awareness that such moments of happiness were precious, precisely because they were so precarious, existing only through magical concealment that could be shattered at any moment by enemies whose determination to destroy them had become the driving force behind one of the most powerful dark wizards in history. The gifts that Harry received for his birthday reflected both the love of those who cared for him and the practical considerations that governed every aspect of their hidden existence, with toys that provided entertainment while remaining safe under the magical conditions that surrounded their home. Sirius's flying broomstick became a particular source of delight, demonstrating Harry's natural affinity for magical objects, while providing brief moments of innocent pleasure that offered relief from the tension that pervaded their concealed sanctuary. As autumn progressed and intelligence reports indicated that Death Eater search efforts were intensifying, the psychological pressure on everyone involved in protecting the Potter family reached levels that tested the limits of human endurance, while the knowledge that their enemies' resources were virtually unlimited made every day feel like borrowed time that might be revoked without warning. The magical protections that surrounded their refuge were constantly being enhanced and refined, but everyone understood that no defense was perfect and that ultimate security depended on maintaining absolute secrecy about their location. Peter's gradual alienation from his friends and growing resentment about his situation created emotional distance that made it increasingly difficult for him to maintain the psychological connections that had originally motivated his acceptance of the Secret Keeper role, while his isolation in his own safe house provided opportunities for the kind of brooding self-pity that fed his sense of being undervalued and overlooked. The combination of enormous responsibility with complete inactivity created internal tensions that he was psychologically unequipped to handle, while his awareness of his friends' continued importance to Order operations highlighted his own marginalization in ways that challenged his fundamental sense of self-worth. The intelligence that eventually reached him through Death Eater intermediaries was carefully crafted to exploit his specific vulnerabilities and insecurities, promising recognition and reward, while minimizing the apparent consequences of providing information that his contacts claimed would be used only to verify the effectiveness of existing security measures. The seduction was gradual and sophisticated, appealing to his desire for importance while providing rationalizations that allowed him to convince himself that cooperation might actually enhance his friend's safety rather than compromising it. The final decision to betray the Potter family's location came not through dramatic confrontation or obvious corruption, but through the slow erosion of moral boundaries that occurred when someone whose fundamental character was weak faced pressures that exceeded his ability to resist while being offered alternatives that seemed to provide escape from responsibilities he had never wanted and was proving unable to bear. The information that sealed James and Lily Potter's fate was delivered through channels that Peter had convinced himself were safe, by someone who had persuaded himself that his betrayal might somehow save the very people he was condemning to death. The last days before the final confrontation were marked by an atmosphere of false calm that reflected the Potter family's determination to maintain normal routines despite growing awareness that their concealment might not endure much longer. While intelligence reports suggested that their enemies were closing in through methods that conventional security analysis had failed to anticipate, the love that bound the family together had become both their greatest strength and their most dangerous vulnerability, creating magical effects that exceeded anything in recorded history, while painting targets on their backs that made them the highest priority for elimination by forces whose power and ruthlessness had already claimed countless innocent lives. In the quiet moments between crises, as James and Lily held their sleeping son and felt the protective magic that surrounded him like a warm embrace, they understood that they were living through the final chapter of a story that had begun with prophecy and would end with sacrifice, though the exact form that sacrifice would take remained hidden behind veils of possibility that only time would lift to reveal the destiny that awaited them all. The final weeks of October 1981 passed with agonizing slowness for those who understood that momentous events were approaching with the inexorable certainty of winter's arrival, while the general magical population went about their daily routines in blissful ignorance of the forces gathering in shadows that would soon reshape their world in ways that none of them could have imagined. In his hidden safe house, Peter Pettigrew sat alone with thoughts that had grown increasingly dark and twisted as the weight of his responsibilities combined with his festering resentments to create a psychological storm that was rapidly approaching its breaking point. The isolation that had been intended to protect him from Death Eater detection had instead provided perfect conditions for the kind of brooding self-examination that fed every insecurity and magnified every slight until his perception of reality became so distorted that betrayal seemed not just justified but necessary for his own survival, and even beneficial to the friends he was preparing to condemn. The safe house that should have been his sanctuary had become a prison where his own thoughts were his cruelest tormentors, while the magical protections that surrounded him felt increasingly like walls that separated him from a world where his friends continued to achieve glory and recognition, while he remained forgotten and undervalued. The Death Eater contact that eventually reached him came not through dramatic confrontation or obvious corruption, but through subtle approaches that exploited his deepest vulnerabilities while providing rationalizations that allowed him to convince himself that cooperation might actually serve everyone's interests better than continued adherence to loyalties that had never been properly appreciated or rewarded. The promises whispered in dark corners spoke of recognition and importance that his friends had never offered, while the threats implied consequences for his family and associates that could be avoided only through providing information that his contacts claimed would be used merely to verify existing intelligence rather than to cause actual harm. His transformation from reluctant conspirator to active betrayer occurred gradually over several weeks of carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation that preyed upon insecurities that had been building since his school years, when he had first begun to understand that his magical abilities and personal qualities would never match those of his more gifted friends. The Death Eaters who recruited him understood his character better than he understood it himself, recognizing the combination of cowardice and resentment that made him perfect for their purposes, while providing him with justifications that allowed him to maintain the illusion that he was acting from noble motives rather than simple self-interest. The final decision to reveal the Potter family's location was made not in a moment of dramatic moral collapse, but through the slow erosion of ethical boundaries that occurred when someone whose fundamental character was weak faced pressures that exceeded his ability to resist while being offered alternatives that seemed to provide escape from responsibilities he had never wanted and was proving unable to bear. The information that would seal his friend's fate was delivered through channels that Peter had convinced himself were secure, to contacts who had persuaded him that his betrayal would somehow result in mercy for those he claimed to love, despite his willingness to sacrifice them for his own perceived benefit. The intelligence reached Voldemort through a network of intermediaries designed to protect Peter's identity, while ensuring that the Dark Lord received accurate information about the Potter family's location and the magical protections that surrounded their refuge. The reaction to this long-awaited breakthrough was immediate and intense, as months of frustrated searching and growing paranoia about the prophecy's implications gave way to cold satisfaction that the threat to his supremacy could finally be eliminated through direct action that would also serve as demonstration to his followers and enemies alike of his power to destroy anyone who dared oppose his will. The planning for the assault on Godric's Hollow was conducted with meticulous attention to detail that reflected both Voldemort's recognition of his target's capabilities and his determination to avoid any possibility of failure that might allow the prophesied threat to escape and potentially grow stronger with time and experience. Intelligence gathered through Peter's betrayal was supplemented by reconnaissance that mapped every protective enchantment surrounding the Potter refuge, while identifying weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with sufficient magical power and ruthless determination to overcome defenses that had been crafted through love and sustained by sacrifice. The Dark Lord's decision to undertake the mission personally, rather than delegating it to subordinates, reflected his understanding that the prophesied child represented a threat that transcended normal tactical considerations to encompass fundamental questions about his own destiny and invincibility. The magical connection implied by the prophecy's wording suggested that this confrontation would be more than simple assassination, but rather a test of power that would determine whether his transformation into something beyond human limitations had been sufficient to overcome forces that he didn't fully understand but instinctively feared. Halloween night 1981 arrived with atmospheric conditions that seemed to reflect the supernatural significance of events that were about to unfold, as unseasonable mists rolled through Godric's Hollow, while the ancient stones of the village seemed to whisper warnings that only the most sensitive magical instruments could detect. In their protected cottage, James and Lily Potter went through the routines of evening that had become precious rituals during their months of concealment, sharing dinner while Harry played with toys that had been charmed for safety, while their parents maintained the cheerful facade that protected their son from understanding the dangers that surrounded his innocent existence. The failure of their detection systems to provide warning of Voldemort's approach reflected the catastrophic effectiveness of Peter's betrayal, as the Dark Lord's knowledge of their exact location and protective measures allowed him to bypass magical safeguards that should have been impregnable, while approaching through methods that their defensive planning had never anticipated. The Fidelius charm that had been their ultimate protection became their greatest vulnerability once its secret keeper chose treachery over loyalty, transforming absolute security into complete exposure in an instant that left them defenseless against enemies whose power exceeded anything they had prepared to face. James Potter's recognition that their concealment had been compromised came too late to allow for escape or effective preparation, as Voldemort's arrival was announced not by alarms or warning signs, but by the simple sound of footsteps on the garden path outside their front door. The magical protections that surrounded the cottage began failing systematically as the Dark Lord's presence overwhelmed enchantments that had been crafted to repel ordinary threats, but were inadequate against someone whose power approached the theoretical limits of what individual wizards could achieve through dedication to the darkest aspects of magical knowledge and practice. The final confrontation between James Potter and Lord Voldemort lasted only minutes, but encompassed a lifetime's worth of courage and determination. As the young father fought desperately to protect his family, despite understanding that his chances of survival were virtually non-existent against an enemy whose magical abilities exceeded his own by margins that made conventional dueling techniques irrelevant. His last spell was a shielding charm designed not to defeat his opponent, but to buy precious seconds that might allow Lily to implement whatever protective magic she had been developing during their hidden months, while his final thought was a prayer that his sacrifice might somehow contribute to saving the son he would never see grow up. Lily Potter's desperate flight up the stairs toward Harry's nursery was accompanied by the sound of James's death and the knowledge that she was now the only barrier between her child and an enemy whose power was matched only by his absolute commitment to eliminating anyone who might threaten his assumed supremacy. The protective enchantments she had been researching and refining during their concealment were still theoretical rather than fully tested, requiring emotional commitment and personal sacrifice that went far beyond anything she had previously imagined she might be called upon to provide for her family's welfare. The nursery where Harry played with his toys became the stage for events that would reshape the magical world through demonstration of power that transcended normal understanding of how magic functioned when channeled through love rather than hatred, selflessness rather than ambition, and sacrifice rather than self-preservation. Lily's final act was to place herself physically between her son and the Dark Lord, while channeling every ounce of her magical ability and emotional commitment into protective enchantments that she hoped might shield Harry from harm, even if they could not save her own life in the process. Voldemort's entry into the nursery was marked by casual confidence that reflected his certainty that the prophecy's threat would be eliminated within moments, leaving him free to continue his campaign of magical supremacy without concern for mystical warnings about chosen ones or ancient magic that he considered irrelevant to someone who had transcended normal human limitations through dedication to power in its purest forms. The killing curse he prepared was charged with magical energy sufficient to destroy multiple targets, while his satisfaction at finally confronting the prophesied threat was tempered only by slight disappointment that such a significant enemy had proven so easy to locate and eliminate. Lily's plea for her son's life was met with contempt that reflected Voldemort's fundamental inability to understand motivations that placed others' welfare above personal survival, while her refusal to stand aside, despite being offered the chance to live, demonstrated the kind of moral courage that he had abandoned so completely that he could no longer recognize it as anything other than foolish weakness. Her death, when it came, was swift and apparently final, ending the brief struggle between protective mother and genocidal destroyer in exactly the manner that everyone present expected, given the vast disparity in their magical abilities and tactical positions. But the moment when Voldemort turned his wand toward Harry Potter marked the beginning of events that defied every prediction and challenged every assumption about the nature of magical power and the forces that governed its application in circumstances where love confronted hatred with absolute commitment from both sides. The killing curse that erupted from the Dark Lord's wand carried enough magical energy to destroy a dozen ordinary targets, its green light filling the nursery with the cold radiance of death itself, while the incantation echoed with power that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The curse's encounter with Lily's sacrificial protection created magical phenomena that had no precedent in recorded history, as ancient forces that most contemporary wizards considered purely theoretical were awakened through emotional commitment that transcended normal human limitations, while channeling power that drew its strength from sources that death could not touch or corrupt. The protective magic that Lily had woven through months of desperate research and powered through ultimate sacrifice proved stronger than the killing curse that had never failed its caster, creating barriers that not only shielded Harry from harm, but reflected the deadly energy back toward its source, with interest compounded by righteous fury. The destruction of Voldemort's physical form was as complete as it was unexpected, reducing someone who had seemed invincible to scattered atoms, while leaving behind only the faintest echo of the consciousness that had driven the most feared dark wizard in centuries to seek immortality through methods that had ultimately proven inadequate when confronted by magic that was literally powered by love rather than fear. The explosion that marked his apparent death was visible throughout Godric's Hollow, while the magical shockwave that followed disrupted every dark enchantment for miles around and left sensitive observers with the unmistakable impression that something fundamental had changed in the balance between light and darkness. Harry Potter's survival was marked not just by his continued breathing, but by physical evidence of his encounter with magical forces that should have destroyed him completely, as the lightning bolt scar that appeared on his forehead reflected the permanent connection that had been created between him and the enemy who had tried to kill him. The mark would serve as both reminder of the night his parents died and symbol of his unique status as someone who had survived the unsurvivable while gaining abilities and insights that would prove crucial during future confrontations with forces that most wizards never encountered or imagined. The cottage that had been their sanctuary was left in ruins by magical forces that had been unleashed during the confrontation, its walls blasted apart, and its protective enchantments shattered by energies that had exceeded anything its builders had anticipated when they designed defenses that were supposed to be adequate against conventional magical assault. The destruction was so complete that subsequent investigators would struggle to reconstruct exactly what had happened during those final moments. Though the evidence of extraordinary magical activity was unmistakable to anyone with sufficient expertise to interpret the residual energy patterns, Hagrid's arrival at the scene came through Dumbledore's prescient understanding that events of enormous significance were unfolding in Godric's Hollow, though even the headmaster's considerable abilities had not allowed him to predict the exact nature of what would occur when prophecy finally confronted the dark wizard who sought to prevent its fulfillment. The half-giant's mission to rescue Harry reflected long-standing contingency plans that had been developed for exactly such circumstances, though the discovery of the infant's miraculous survival exceeded even Dumbledore's most optimistic expectations about possible outcomes. The removal of Harry from the destroyed cottage was conducted under security conditions that reflected both the immediate dangers that might still threaten the prophesied child and the broader implications of what had occurred for the ongoing war between Order forces and Death Eater remnants who might seek revenge even after their master's apparent destruction. The magical protections that surrounded Harry during his transport were enhanced by residual energy from his mother's sacrifice, creating barriers that would endure for years, while providing security that no conventional defensive magic could have achieved. The immediate aftermath of Voldemort's destruction was marked by confusion and disbelief throughout both sides of the magical conflict, as Death Eaters struggled to understand what had happened to their supposedly invincible leader, while Order members grappled with the implications of a victory that had been achieved through sacrifice rather than military success. The dark mark that had branded Voldemort's followers began to fade as the magical connection to their master was severed, though the psychological and spiritual marks left by years of service to evil would prove more difficult to erase than the physical symbols of their allegiance. The news of the Dark Lord's defeat spread through magical Britain with unprecedented speed, carried by owls and magical communication networks that had been monitoring the situation while hoping against hope that somehow the prophesied confrontation might result in victory for the forces of light rather than the triumph of evil that most observers had expected. The celebrations that erupted throughout the wizarding world reflected years of suppressed fear and desperate hope, though the cost of victory in terms of lives lost and families destroyed would temper the joy with recognition that some prices could never be considered acceptable regardless of what they had purchased. Peter Pettigrew's reaction to news of his former friends' deaths was complex and contradictory, mixing genuine grief for the people he had loved, despite betraying with relief that his treachery had apparently succeeded in protecting him from the consequences that he had feared would result from continued loyalty to a losing causa. His attempts to maintain his cover as a faithful friend who had been excluded from the final tragedy by circumstances beyond his control required acting abilities that he barely possessed, while his knowledge of his own guilt created psychological pressure that would eventually drive him to even more desperate measures to avoid exposure and punishment. The magical world that emerged from Halloween night 1981 was fundamentally different from what had existed before, not just because Voldemort's apparent death had ended the immediate threat of genocidal violence, but because the manner of his defeat had demonstrated the reality of magical forces that most contemporary wizards had considered purely theoretical. The power of love, as expressed through willing sacrifice, had proven stronger than hatred channeled through superior magical ability, while the survival of an infant who should have died had provided proof that some forms of protection transcended normal understanding of how defensive magic functioned under extreme circumstances. Harry Potter's placement with his Muggle relatives reflected Dumbledore's understanding that the magical protection created by his mother's sacrifice would be enhanced through blood connections that maintained the emotional and spiritual links necessary to sustain ancient magic that drew its power from family bonds rather than conventional magical sources. The decision was controversial among Order members, who felt that the boy deserved to be raised within the magical world that had been saved through his parents' sacrifice. But the headmaster's analysis of the protective requirements outweighed other considerations in determining what would best serve Harry's long-term survival and development. The house in Godric's Hollow was left as a memorial to the events that had occurred within its walls, though the magical residue from Lily's protective enchantments made the ruins dangerous for ordinary visitors, while attracting pilgrims who sought to understand how love had proven stronger than death in the most literal sense possible. The site would remain significant for years to come as both tourist attraction and genuine shrine to the power of sacrificial love, while the lessons learned from studying its magical aftermath would influence protective spell development throughout the wizarding world. The victory that had been achieved through such terrible cost marked the end of one phase of the struggle between light and darkness, while setting the stage for future confrontations that would test whether the power demonstrated on Halloween night could be sustained and transmitted to new generations who would face challenges that their predecessors had never imagined. The boy who lived had survived the night that changed everything, but his real trials were only just beginning, as forces set in motion by his survival would eventually require him to understand and wield the same power that had saved him when hope seemed lost and love appeared powerless against the darkness that sought to consume everything good and beautiful in the magical world. The dawn that followed Halloween night 1981 brought with it a silence that seemed to permeate the very soul of magical Britain, as if the world itself was holding its breath while trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired in a small cottage in Godric's Hollow. But for those Death Eaters who had not been present when their master met his incomprehensible fate, the news of Voldemort's destruction created not relief, but desperate fury that demanded expression through violence against anyone who might have contributed to their cause's apparent defeat. Bellatrix Lestrange stood in the drawing room of a manor house whose elegant furnishings seemed to mock her with their peaceful domesticity, her dark eyes reflecting depths of madness that had been building for years, but were now focused with laser intensity on a single objective that consumed every rational thought and civilized impulse she might once have possessed. The dark mark on her left arm had begun to fade as the magical connection to her master was severed, but rather than accepting this as evidence of his true death, she convinced herself that it indicated some form of magical imprisonment that could be reversed if she could locate him and provide the assistance that his weakened condition obviously required. Her companions in this desperate quest were united not by hope, but by shared inability to accept a reality that challenged everything they had believed about their master's invincibility and their own importance within his grand design for magical supremacy. Barty Crouch Jr.'s participation reflected psychological damage that went far beyond simple ideological fanaticism to encompass complete abandonment of moral reasoning in service of someone who had provided him with purpose and identity that his privileged upbringing had never offered. His father's position within the ministry had given him access to information and resources that made him invaluable for planning operations that required inside knowledge of official investigation methods and security procedures. Rodolphus and Rabastan Lestrange brought to their conspiracy the kind of methodical cruelty that had made them effective Death Eater operatives throughout the war, while their family connections provided financial resources and safe houses that allowed for extended planning of operations that would have been impossible without substantial logistical support. Their motivation was less personal devotion to Voldemort than professional pride that refused to accept defeat by enemies they considered inferior in breeding, magical ability, and commitment to the cause that had given meaning to their otherwise empty lives. The selection of Frank and Alice Longbottom as targets for their desperate interrogation was based on intelligence that completely misunderstood the circumstances of Voldemort's defeat while reflecting assumptions about order, operations, and information sharing that proved catastrophically incorrect. The logic that led them to believe that successful Aurors would possess knowledge about their master's location was internally consistent but based on false premises that turned their meticulous planning into elaborate preparation for a mission that could never achieve its stated objectives, regardless of how thoroughly they tortured their victims. The approach to Longbottom Manor was conducted with professional competence that reflected years of experience in infiltrating protected locations and overwhelming defensive measures through coordinated magical assault, while their knowledge of Auror training and tactics allowed them to anticipate and counter the responses that their targets would likely attempt when faced with sudden attack by superior numbers. The timing of their assault was carefully chosen to occur when Frank and Alice would be isolated with their infant son, making resistance more difficult while ensuring that any information they provided would not be contaminated by outside influences or protective lies designed to mislead interrogators. The battle that erupted when the Death Eaters breached the manor's defenses was brief but vicious, demonstrating the gap between theoretical, magical education and practical combat experience, as trained Aurors found themselves outmatched by opponents whose willingness to use forbidden curses without hesitation gave them decisive advantages in close quarters fighting. Frank Longbottom's attempts to coordinate defensive strategies with his wife while protecting their son created tactical complications that their enemies exploited ruthlessly, while Alice's determination to shield Neville from harm limited her ability to employ the aggressive counterattacks that might have evened the odds against opponents who acknowledged no moral constraints. The capture of the Longbottom family was accomplished through methods that revealed the systematic brutality that had characterized Death Eater operations throughout the war, as the attackers employed non-lethal but incapacitating curses that left their victims conscious and aware, but unable to resist the interrogation that would follow. The restraining spells that bound Frank and Alice were enhanced with magical compulsions designed to prevent suicide attempts or self-injury that might allow them to escape questioning, while the positioning of baby Neville, where his parents could see him, served both as psychological leverage and implicit threat about what would happen if their cooperation proved insufficient. Bellatrix's approach to extracting information from her captives reflected the combination of magical expertise and psychological sadism that had made her one of Voldemort's most valued lieutenants, as she understood that physical torture alone was often less effective than emotional manipulation that attacked victims' deepest fears and strongest attachments. Her use of the Cruciatus Curse was artfully calibrated to cause maximum pain, while avoiding the permanent damage that might end the interrogation prematurely, while her threats against Neville were designed to create the kind of desperate cooperation that would make parents reveal secrets they would die rather than surrender under other circumstances. The questions she posed revealed the depth of her delusion about Voldemort's survival and the extent to which her understanding of recent events had been distorted by inability to accept information that challenged her fundamental beliefs about her master's invincibility. Her demands for details about his current location and condition demonstrated complete ignorance of what had actually occurred at Godric's Hollow, while her growing frustration at receiving truthful answers that contradicted her expectations led to escalating violence that transformed interrogation into pure sadism, motivated by rage rather than any practical objective. Frank Longbottom's attempts to explain that they possessed no information about Voldemort's whereabouts because he was genuinely dead were met with disbelief, so complete that Bellatrix interpreted his honesty as elaborate deception designed to protect secrets that she was convinced must exist. Her magical abilities allowed her to detect when subjects were lying under normal circumstances, but her psychological need to believe in her master's continued existence created blind spots that made her incapable of recognizing truth when it contradicted her delusions, leading to interrogation techniques that became increasingly divorced from any rational purpose. Alice Longbottom's desperate pleas for mercy were motivated not by personal fear, but by maternal terror for her son's safety, as she understood that their captor's growing frustration would inevitably lead to threats against Neville that might escalate into actual violence if they continued to fail to provide information that didn't exist. Her offers to reveal Order secrets and operational details that might genuinely interest their interrogators were dismissed as attempts at misdirection, while her increasingly frantic explanations about Voldemort's true fate were interpreted as sophisticated resistance that required enhanced persuasion methods to overcome. The prolonged application of the Cruciatus Curse that finally destroyed the Longbottom's sanity was conducted with methodical precision that reflected Bellatrix's understanding of the spell's effects on human consciousness and her determination to push her victims beyond the breaking point in hopes that extreme suffering might force them to reveal secrets that her rational mind should have recognized they didn't possess. The magical energy required for such sustained torture was enormous, but her fanatical dedication to her master's memory provided motivation that allowed her to maintain the spell far beyond what most wizards could endure, without permanent damage to their own magical cause. The moment when Frank and Alice Longbottom's minds finally shattered under pressure that exceeded human endurance was marked not by sudden collapse, but by gradual dissolution of personality and memory that left them conscious but unable to recognize their surroundings, their captors, or even their own son, whose cries had provided the emotional leverage that made their torture so effective. Their descent into madness was complete and irreversible, destroying not just their ability to provide information, but their capacity to understand what had been done to them, or why their suffering had been considered necessary by people whose cause they had never threatened in ways that justified such retaliation. Bellatrix's reaction to her victim's mental collapse was complex and contradictory, mixing satisfaction at having inflicted maximum punishment with frustration at failing to extract the information that she had convinced herself they must possess, while her growing awareness that she had destroyed valuable intelligence sources without achieving any useful results created cognitive dissonance that she resolved by blaming her victims for their supposed obstinacy rather than questioning her own assumptions about what they might have known. Her decision to continue the interrogation, even after it became clear that further torture would serve no practical purpose, revealed the extent to which sadism had replaced rational planning in her approach to advancing her master's cause. The discovery of the Longbottom's condition by ministry officials, who responded to magical disturbances reported by neighbors, created a public relations crisis that forced even the most reluctant government administrators to acknowledge that Death Eater activities had not ended with Voldemort's apparent defeat, while the shocking brutality of the attack demonstrated that some of his followers were prepared to continue their campaign of terror, regardless of whether their master was available to direct their efforts. The medical assessment that followed confirmed what witnesses had already suspected: that Frank and Alice had been subjected to torture so severe that their recovery was impossible under any treatment methods currently known to magical medicine. The placement of the Longbottoms in Street Mungo's specialized ward for magical injuries created a living memorial to the costs of resistance that served both as inspiration for those who continued the fight and warning about the prices that such dedication might exact from families who chose to oppose genocidal ideologies. Their condition remained stable but hopeless, with consciousness that flickered between lucidity and complete disconnection from reality, while their magical abilities remained intact but useless for communication or self-care that required coherent thought processes. Baby Neville's survival of his parents' torture was miraculous in its own right, as infants exposed to prolonged cruciatus curse effects typically suffered permanent magical damage, even when not directly targeted by the spell, while the psychological trauma of witnessing such extreme violence should have created developmental problems that would affect him for the rest of his life. His placement with his grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, reflected both practical necessity and recognition that his upbringing would require understanding of the forces that had destroyed his family, while providing him with tools needed to defend himself against enemies who might target him for revenge or symbolic purposes. The investigation that followed the attack revealed security failures that extended far beyond simple bad luck or insufficient preparation to encompass systematic problems with protective procedures that had been developed for peacetime conditions, rather than ongoing warfare against enemies whose dedication exceeded rational calculation. The ease with which the Death Eaters had penetrated defenses that should have been adequate against conventional criminal assault demonstrated the need for enhanced security measures that acknowledged the continued existence of threats that official victory celebrations had ignored or minimized. The capture and trial of Bellatrix Lestrange and her accomplices provided the Ministry with opportunities to demonstrate decisive action against Death Eater terrorism while serving justice for crimes that had shocked even those who thought they understood the depths of magical cruelty. But the legal proceedings also revealed divisions within the government about appropriate punishment for offences that exceeded anything covered by existing statutes. The defendants' complete lack of remorse for their actions and their continued insistence on Voldemort's survival created courtroom scenes that challenged basic assumptions about sanity and moral responsibility in ways that conventional legal frameworks struggled to address. Bellatrix's testimony during her trial demonstrated the complete corruption of someone whose intelligence and magical abilities might have served beneficial purposes under different circumstances, but had been perverted by ideological fanaticism that acknowledged no moral boundaries or humanitarian constraints. Her proud declaration of loyalty to Voldemort and her promises to continue serving his cause upon his return revealed psychological damage that went beyond simple criminal behavior to encompass fundamental alienation from human society, its values, while her detailed descriptions of the torture she had inflicted seemed designed to maximize public horror rather than generate sympathy or understanding. The sentences imposed on the conspirators reflected both the severity of their crimes and the government's recognition that some offences required punishment that exceeded normal legal precedents, as life imprisonment in Azkaban was considered barely adequate for individuals whose actions had destroyed innocent lives, while serving no rational purpose beyond satisfying sadistic impulses dressed up as political ideology. The magical nature of their crimes also required specialized incarceration that could contain wizards whose abilities and dedication made them dangerous, even under the most secure conditions that conventional prison systems could provide. The broader implications of the Longbottom attack extended far beyond its immediate victims to encompass questions about the completeness of victory over Voldemort's forces and the adequacy of security measures that had been implemented to protect Order families and other potential targets for Death Eater revenge. The systematic brutality of the assault demonstrated that some enemies remained committed to continuing their campaign of terror, regardless of whether their original objectives remained achievable, while the torture methods employed revealed knowledge and capabilities that suggested ongoing organization rather than random acts of desperate individuals. The psychological impact on surviving Order members was profound and lasting, as people who had celebrated victory found themselves confronting evidence that the war's end had not brought the security and peace they had anticipated, while the realization that enemies remained capable of striking without warning created paranoia and defensive measures that affected their ability to return to normal civilian life. The protective enchantments that had been sufficient during active warfare now seemed inadequate for peacetime conditions that included ongoing threats from adversaries whose motivation had shifted from serving their master to seeking revenge against those who had contributed to his defeat. Frank and Alice's fate served as stark reminder of the prices that resistance movements extracted from their participants, as two people who had dedicated their lives to protecting innocent civilians found themselves reduced to helpless victims whose sacrifice served no strategic purpose beyond satisfying their enemies' need for revenge against the Regond. Order's success in eliminating Voldemort. Their condition also demonstrated the limitations of magical medicine when confronted with injuries that transcended simple physical damage to encompass complete destruction of personality and memory, creating suffering that no healing spell could address or alleviate. The contrast between their fate and Harry Potter's miraculous survival highlighted the role that chance and circumstance played in determining outcomes that logical analysis suggested should have been predictable, while the different nature of their enemies' objectives, elimination versus interrogation, had created tactical situations that produced vastly different results, despite involving similar levels of magical power and ruthless determination. The randomness of who lived and who suffered revealed uncomfortable truths about heroism and sacrifice that challenged comfortable narratives about justice and deserved outcomes. Neville's early development in his grandmother's care was marked by signs of trauma that reflected his exposure to extreme violence during crucial developmental periods. Though the specific magical protections that had shielded him from direct harm remained mysterious to healers, who examined him for evidence of curse damage or psychological injury, his magical abilities manifested inconsistently and often defensively, suggesting that his experiences had created instinctive responses to perceived threats, while potentially limiting his capacity for the kind of offensive magic that would be required for advanced magical education or professional development. The legacy of the Longbottom attack extended into the broader magical community through its demonstration that Death Eater ideology remained dangerous even after its primary architect had been eliminated. While the specific torture methods employed revealed knowledge and techniques that suggested ongoing organization and training, rather than improvised revenge by isolated individuals. The implications for security planning were enormous, as protective measures designed for conventional criminal threats proved inadequate against enemies whose motivation transcended normal risk-benefit calculations to encompass fanatical dedication that accepted any personal cost in the service of causes that rational analysis suggested were hopeless. The medical research that emerged from attempts to treat the Longbottom's condition, advanced understanding of how prolonged exposure to the Cruciatus curse affected magical consciousness and neural pathways, though the knowledge gained came at terrible cost to the subjects whose suffering provided data that might help future victims of similar attacks. The magical damage they had sustained was unprecedented in its completeness and apparently irreversible through any treatment methods that existed within contemporary magical medicine, creating challenges for healers who struggled to provide care that improved quality of life without offering false hope for recovery that everyone understood was impossible. The anniversary of the attack became a day of remembrance within Order circles and the broader oral community, honoring not just Frank and Alice's sacrifice, but acknowledging the ongoing risks faced by those who chose to oppose dark magic, regardless of personal consequences or family considerations. Their names joined the roster of heroes whose dedication had preserved magical civilization at costs that could never be fully calculated or adequately honored through conventional memorials or recognition ceremonies that seemed inadequate. When measured against the magnitude of what had been lost in service of protecting others, as the months following the attack passed, and it became clear that the Longbottom's condition would never improve, their tragedy served as both inspiration and warning for new generations of magical law enforcement officers who would face enemies whose cruelty exceeded anything their training could prepare them to encounter. The price of vigilance had been paid in full by people whose only crime was serving justice too effectively, while their sacrifice ensured that others would understand the true nature of the threats they faced, and the dedication required to overcome forces that acknowledged no moral boundaries in pursuit of power that corrupted everything it touched. The years that followed Voldemort's apparent destruction unfolded with agonizing slowness for those who had dedicated their lives to fighting his regime, as the sudden absence of their defining enemy left a void that no amount of celebration or official recognition could adequately fill. The Order of the Phoenix, which had existed as a tight-knit family bound together by shared danger and common purpose, found itself struggling to maintain cohesion when the external pressures that had forged their bonds disappeared overnight, leaving individual members to confront personal demons and unresolved trauma without the protective framework of active resistance that had given meaning to their suffering. The dissolution of the Order as an active organization was accomplished gradually rather than through formal ceremony, as members who had risked everything for their shared cause discovered that peacetime offered opportunities and obligations that had been impossible during wartime, but now demanded attention that competing loyalties could no longer defer. The safe houses that had sheltered fugitive families were returned to their original owners or abandoned entirely, while communication networks that had operated in secrecy for over a decade were systematically dismantled to prevent their potential misuse by criminals who might exploit revolutionary infrastructure for purposes that had nothing to do with the noble ideals that had motivated their creation. Alastair Moody's transition from wartime operative to peacetime aura proved particularly challenging, as his psychological conditioning for constant vigilance and his physical adaptations to permanent threat made him poorly suited for the routine law enforcement work that characterized ministry operations when enemies were ordinary criminals rather than genocidal fanatics wielding forbidden magic. His legendary paranoia, which had been essential for survival during active warfare, now seemed excessive and counterproductive in environments where colleagues expected normal social interaction and suspects possessed rights that Death Eaters had never acknowledged or respected during their campaign of terror. His continuing work with the Auror Department focused increasingly on the most dangerous cases that other officers were reluctant to handle, as his expertise with dark magic detection and his willingness to employ methods that conventional law enforcement avoided made him invaluable for situations where standard procedures proved inadequate. The magical devices he had developed during wartime found new applications in peacetime security work, though their constant clicking and humming served as persistent reminders of threats that most people preferred to believe no longer existed in a world where Voldemort's defeat was supposed to have eliminated the need for such extreme vigilance. The trials of captured Death Eaters provided Moody with opportunities to demonstrate the intelligence-gathering techniques he had perfected during active operations, while his testimony about enemy capabilities and organizational methods proved crucial for ensuring that sentences reflected the true scope of crimes that conventional legal frameworks struggled to address adequately. His presence in courtrooms was both reassuring to prosecutors who needed expert witnesses and disturbing to defendants who recognized him as the architect of many of their colleagues' captures, while his detailed knowledge of Death Eater operations revealed the systematic nature of crimes that some observers had dismissed as random violence by isolated extremists. But perhaps the most significant challenge he faced during the transition to peacetime was learning to function in a society where his reputation for effectiveness was balanced by growing concern about his methods and mental stability, as colleagues who had appreciated his results during wartime began to question whether such dedication to threat detection was healthy or sustainable over extended periods. The scars and artificial limbs that marked his body told stories of sacrifice that commanded respect, but they also served as visible evidence of the psychological costs associated with his approach to law enforcement, creating distance between him and officers whose own experiences had been less traumatic. Remus Lupin's struggle with unemployment and social isolation reflected broader problems faced by werewolves throughout magical society, as Voldemort's use of lycanthropes as weapons had reinforced existing prejudices while creating new associations between his condition and the terrorism that had traumatized entire communities. His academic qualifications and orders service should have made him an attractive candidate for numerous positions, but the monthly transformations that made him periodically unavailable, combined with irrational fears about his potential dangerousness, created barriers that logical argument could never overcome among employers whose decisions were influenced more by prejudice than evidence. The poverty that characterized his post-war existence was made more bitter by the knowledge that his friends had moved on to successful careers and family relationships that his condition made impossible, while the social stigma attached to lycanthropy meant that even casual friendships required constant vigilance about maintaining secrets that could destroy relationships if revealed at inappropriate moments. His isolation was compounded by the loss of the order community that had provided acceptance and purpose during wartime, leaving him without the social support networks that most people took for granted in their daily lives and professional development. His attempts to find employment that could accommodate his condition led him through a series of temporary positions that never lasted long enough to provide financial security or professional satisfaction. As employers who initially seemed sympathetic to his situation inevitably discovered reasons to terminate his services when his transformations created scheduling conflicts, or when other employees expressed concerns about working alongside someone whose magical condition was poorly understood by most contemporary wizards. The cycle of hope and disappointment that characterized his job searches created psychological damage that compounded the social isolation and economic hardship that had become the defining features of his civilian existence. The meager income he earned through temporary work was supplemented by occasional assistance from former order members who understood his situation, though his pride made him reluctant to accept help that felt like charity rather than earned compensation. While the knowledge that his friends' success was partly built on victories he had helped achieve made their prosperity seem like a reproach to his own failure to transition successfully to peacetime opportunities. The magical world that he had helped preserve offered him no place of dignity or respect, treating his wartime service as irrelevant to current employment decisions that were based on prejudices that victory over Voldemort had done nothing to address or eliminate. Severus Snape's return to Hogwarts as Potions Master represented both personal redemption and ongoing psychological torture, as his position required him to interact daily with colleagues who viewed him with suspicion based on his Death Eater past while teaching students whose parents might have suffered from actions he had taken or supported before his conversion to Dumbledore's cause. His expertise in potions and defensive magic made him valuable to the school despite the controversies surrounding his appointment, but his classroom manner reflected the defensive hostility of someone who expected rejection and prepared for it through preemptive aggression toward anyone who might judge his worthiness. The protection that Dumbledore provided was both professional necessity and personal burden, as Snape's survival depended entirely on the headmaster's continued support against ministry officials and parents who questioned whether someone with his background could be trusted with responsibility for young people's magical education. The knowledge that his position was precarious created additional stress that manifested in teaching methods that were harsh even by Hogwarts standards, while his determination to prove his competence through academic results led to classroom environments that prioritized achievement over student welfare or enjoyment of magical learning. His private research during this period focused on areas that reflected his wartime experiences, particularly antidotes and healing potions that could address injuries caused by dark magic exposure, though his work remained largely unrecognized by the broader magical community, whose members preferred to forget about the medical needs created by conflicts they hoped were permanently resolved. His innovations in protective magic were similarly undervalued by colleagues, who saw his expertise as evidence of dangerous knowledge rather than valuable skills that could benefit future generations of wizards who might face similar threats. The psychological isolation that characterized his position at Hogwarts was intensified by his inability to discuss his double agent work or the specific contributions he had made to Order operations, as the security requirements that had protected his cover during wartime continued to limit his ability to seek recognition or understanding from people who might have offered friendship or professional respect if they had known the full truth about his sacrifices. His heroism remained hidden behind facades of competence and hostility that protected him from exposure while preventing him from forming the human connections that might have eased his transition to civilian life. Harry Potter's placement with the Dursley family created living conditions that reflected both the magical protections that his mother's sacrifice had provided and the mundane cruelties that resulted from forcing magical children into households where their nature was viewed as shameful abnormality rather than precious gift requiring careful nurturing. The blood connection that sustained Lily's protective enchantments also trapped him in an environment where love was rationed carefully and magical development was actively discouraged through methods that bordered on psychological abuse, creating childhood experiences that would affect his personality and capabilities throughout his life. The Dursleys' treatment of their magical nephew reflected broader attitudes within Muggle society toward phenomena they couldn't understand or control, while their specific responses to Harry's accidental magic revealed character flaws that made them unsuitable guardians. Despite the magical advantages that his placement with them provided for his physical security, their determination to suppress his magical development created internal conflicts that manifested in unpredictable bursts of accidental magic, while their emotional neglect ensured that he would enter the magical world without the basic knowledge about his heritage that most magical children absorbed naturally through family interaction. Petunia Dursley's knowledge of the magical world through her relationship with Lily could have provided valuable guidance for Harry's development, but her resentment over her sister's abilities and her determination to maintain the illusion of normal family life made her actively hostile toward anything that reminded her of magical society and its values. Her efforts to protect her own son from magical influence created household dynamics that positioned Harry as a threat to family stability, rather than a beloved member whose unique gifts deserved celebration and careful cultivation through appropriate magical education. The protective magic that surrounded Harry during his childhood was invisible to Muggle observation but created barriers that would shield him from magical threats while allowing him to develop naturally without premature exposure to the political and social complexities that had shaped his parents' generation. The enchantments that Lily had powered through her sacrifice continued to function as long as he remained with blood relatives, creating security that was absolute within the narrow geographical boundaries of his aunt's home, while providing no protection against the psychological damage caused by emotional neglect and systematic suppression of his magical nature. Kingsley Shacklebolt's advancement within the Ministry's Auror department reflected both his professional competence and his ability to navigate the political complexities that characterized government service during periods when official policy often conflicted with operational necessities. His Order experience had provided insights into effective magical law enforcement that conventional training couldn't match, while his diplomatic skills made him valuable for situations requiring negotiation and compromise, rather than simple application of overwhelming force against clearly identified enemies who could be engaged through straightforward military tactics. His work on tracking down remaining Death Eater cells required the kind of patient intelligence gathering and analysis that had characterized Order operations though the legal constraints that governed ministry actions meant that information obtained through questionable methods could never be used in court proceedings that required evidence meeting standards designed for peacetime criminal justice rather than wartime military operations. The transition from revolutionary tactics to conventional law enforcement created frustrations that tested his commitment to working within institutional frameworks that seemed designed to protect criminals' rights rather than ensuring public safety. The relationships he maintained with former order members provided informal networks that supplemented official intelligence sources while creating potential conflicts of interest when personal loyalties conflicted with professional obligations, particularly in cases where friends requested assistance that couldn't be provided through normal channels without violating regulations designed to prevent abuse of authority. His position within the ministry made him valuable to colleagues who needed someone with connections throughout the magical law enforcement community, but it also made him a target for suspicion from superiors who questioned whether his order affiliations compromised his objectivity in politically sensitive investigations. Arthur Weasley's return to his position in the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office reflected his genuine fascination with Muggle technology, combined with his family's need for steady income that ministry employment provided, despite the low status and minimal advancement opportunities associated with his department. His order service had broadened his understanding of how magical and Muggle worlds intersected in ways that conventional ministry policy rarely acknowledged, while his experiences with Death Eater operations had revealed the extent to which dark wizards exploited gaps in official oversight to conduct illegal experiments and smuggling operations. His work investigating enchanted objects that posed threats to Muggle communities required the kind of technical expertise and cultural sensitivity that few other ministry employees possessed, while his ability to understand both magical theory and Muggle technology made him uniquely qualified to address problems that arose when the two worlds intersected in dangerous ways. The low profile of his department provided cover for investigations that might have attracted unwanted political attention if conducted through more prominent offices, while his reputation for competence and integrity made him trusted by colleagues throughout the ministry hierarchy. The large family that he and Molly were raising created financial pressures that his modest salary could barely address, particularly given the costs associated with magical education and the need to provide appropriate equipment and supplies for children whose magical development required careful guidance and support. The hand-me-down robes and second-hand textbooks that characterized their household economy reflected broader inequalities within magical society that ministry salaries did little to address, while the love and warmth that filled their home provided emotional security that money couldn't purchase, and many wealthier families never achieved. Molly Weasley's transition from active order operations to full-time motherhood represented both personal choice and practical necessity, as the dangers associated with resistance work were incompatible with responsibility for young children whose safety depended on their parents' survival and availability. Her magical abilities, which had been formidable during wartime service, were now focused on domestic applications that created a household environment where love and magic blended seamlessly to provide security and comfort that her children would remember throughout their lives as the foundation for their own moral development. Her fierce protectiveness toward her family extended to former order members and their children, creating extended support networks that helped address the isolation and trauma that many veterans experienced during their adjustment to civilian life. While her practical skills in healing, magic, and household management made her a valuable resource for colleagues who struggled with the mundane challenges of peacetime existence, after years of focusing solely on survival and mission completion during active warfare. The Burrow became an unofficial gathering place for Order veterans and their families, providing neutral ground where former resistance fighters could maintain connections without the security concerns that had characterized their wartime meetings. While the warmth and acceptance that characterized Weasley family hospitality created an atmosphere where psychological healing could occur through simple human connection and shared understanding of experiences that outsiders could never fully comprehend or appreciate. Mad-Eye Moody's increasing isolation from his former colleagues reflected both his psychological inability to adapt to peacetime conditions and his growing reputation as someone whose dedication to threat detection had become indistinguishable from mental illness, making him difficult to work with, despite his continued effectiveness in cases that required his unique expertise. His living arrangements became increasingly elaborate as he implemented security measures designed for wartime conditions in civilian settings, where such precautions seemed paranoid and excessive to neighbors who had never faced the pungent threats that had shaped his approach to daily existence. The magical devices that filled his home served both practical security functions and psychological reassurance needs, providing constant confirmation that his vigilance was still necessary, even when official sources claimed that major threats had been eliminated through Voldemort's defeat. His inability to trust government assurances about public safety was validated by ongoing incidents involving Death Eater sympathizers and dark magic practitioners, though the scale of such threats was far smaller than what had existed during active warfare, making his level of preparation seem disproportionate to reasonable risk assessment. His occasional interactions with former Order members were characterized by warnings about security breaches and emerging threats that they found difficult to take seriously, given the improved conditions that characterized their daily lives, while his detailed analysis of potential vulnerabilities often proved accurate in ways that vindicated his paranoid tendencies, while failing to address the social costs of maintaining such extreme vigilance over extended periods. The respect his colleagues felt for his wartime service was gradually overshadowed by concern for his mental health and questions about whether his continued effectiveness justified the personal price he was paying for his dedication to public safety. The magical world that emerged from this period of adjustment and healing was fundamentally different from what had existed before Voldemort's rise, not just because specific threats had been eliminated, but because the experience of systematic evil had changed how entire communities understood their responsibilities toward protecting vulnerable populations and maintaining the vigilance necessary to prevent future catastrophes. The children who grew up during this transitional period would inherit both the peace that their parents' sacrifice had purchased and the knowledge that such peace was fragile and required constant effort to maintain against forces that could emerge from anywhere when circumstances created opportunities for those who sought power without moral constraints. The veterans who had served in the Order carried forward lessons about courage and sacrifice that would influence magical society for generations to come, while their ongoing struggles with trauma and adjustment served as reminders of the true costs associated with resistance to genocidal ideologies that acknowledged no boundaries in their pursuit of absolute power. Their legacy was written not just in the victory they had achieved, but in the prices they continued to pay for that victory, demonstrating that heroism was measured not in moments of glory, but in the lifetime commitment to values that required daily renewal and constant vigilance to preserve. As the decade progressed, and the immediate aftermath of war gave way to the routines of civilian life, the Order of the Phoenix existed only in memory and informal relationships between people who had shared experiences that bound them together across differences in background and current circumstances. The phoenix that had given them their name had fulfilled its mythological purpose, rising from the ashes of their individual lives to create something greater than its component parts, then dissolving back into those individual elements once its historical mission was complete, leaving behind only the hope that such dedication could be summoned again if future circumstances required similar sacrifice from new generations of heroes. The summer of 1995 arrived with an oppressive heat that seemed to press down upon magical Britain like a suffocating blanket. Though those sensitive to magical disturbances understood that the atmospheric pressure they felt had nothing to do with weather patterns and everything to do with forces that had been dormant for over a decade, suddenly stirring to malevolent life in shadows that most of the wizarding world preferred to believe remained empty. In the depths of Little Hangleton Graveyard, events had transpired that would soon shatter the comfortable illusion of permanent peace that had allowed an entire generation to grow up believing that the darkness their parents had fought would never return to threaten their children's futures. Albus Dumbledore stood in his circular office at the top of Hogwarts' tallest tower, his aged hands moving with deliberate precision among correspondence that told a story of escalating crisis that official channels refused to acknowledge, while the whirring silver instruments that surrounded his desk registered magical disturbances that confirmed his worst fears about the return of threats that government officials found too frightening to accept as reality. The letter from Harry Potter, delivered by traumatized owl in the early hours of dawn, had contained details about Voldemort's resurrection that left no doubt about the magnitude of the challenge that lay ahead, while the Ministry's categorical denial of such possibilities meant that the response would have to come from sources that operated outside official sanction or support. The decision to reconvene the Order of the Phoenix was made not through formal consultation with surviving members, but through careful analysis of capabilities and loyalties that had endured 14 years of civilian life, as Dumbledore understood that some of those who had served with distinction during the First War might not be willing or able to sacrifice their current stability for renewed participation in activities that could cost them everything they had built during the intervening years of peace. The magical communication that went out to former members was coded in language that would seem innocuous to casual observers while conveying unmistakable meaning to those who understood the references and implications hidden within seemingly mundane social invitations. The response to his summons revealed both the enduring bonds that had been forged during their original service and the ways that time and changing circumstances had affected individual members' willingness to risk their current lives for causes that many people hoped belonged permanently to the past. Some replied immediately with absolute commitment that transcended any personal considerations, while others requested time to arrange family responsibilities and professional obligations that hadn't existed during their youth, when they had possessed nothing to lose, except their own lives and futures that seemed less precious when viewed from the perspective of idealistic young adults who believed that dying for worthy causes was preferable to living without purpose. Arthur and Molly Weasley's acceptance came without hesitation, despite the profound changes that 14 years of marriage and parenthood had brought to their circumstances, as they understood that their children's safety depended ultimately on defeating enemies whose victory would eliminate any possibility of the peaceful family life they had worked so hard to create and maintain. Their large family made them particularly vulnerable to retaliation from Death Eaters who specialized in targeting loved ones to break the spirits of those who opposed Voldemort's will, while their modest financial resources meant that they couldn't provide the kind of elaborate security measures that wealthier families might employ to protect themselves against systematic persecution. The borough's transformation into an unofficial order headquarters reflected both practical necessity and symbolic significance, as the warmth and love that characterized the Weasley home provided psychological counterpoint to the darkness they were preparing to confront. While its rural location offered security advantages that more prominent properties couldn't match without extensive magical modification that might attract unwanted attention from Ministry observers who monitored unusual enchantment activities, the protective wards that Arthur and Molly established around their property were enhanced through techniques learned during their original order service, creating barriers that could withstand assault from enemies whose capabilities had presumably grown during their years of exile and planning for eventual return. Nymphadora Tonks brought to the Reformed Order youth and enthusiasm that had been lacking during the previous war, when most members had been shaped by experiences that emphasized caution and careful planning over the kind of bold action that her generation found appealing. While her metamorphmagus abilities provided operational capabilities that were ideally suited for infiltration and surveillance missions that would be crucial for understanding the scope of Voldemort's rebuilt organization. Her oral training had given her professional expertise in magical law enforcement that complemented her natural talents, while her irreverent attitude toward authority made her particularly effective in situations that required creative approaches to problems that conventional methods couldn't address. Her relationship with Remus Lupin, which developed during this period, represented both personal happiness and operational complication, as romantic attachments created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit, while also providing motivations for extraordinary courage and self-sacrifice that individual survival instincts couldn't match. Their age difference and the social stigma attached to his lycanthropy created additional challenges that had to be navigated carefully to avoid compromising either their personal relationship or their professional effectiveness, while the knowledge that their enemies would certainly target their bond made every moment of happiness precious and precarious, in ways that peacetime couples never experienced. Kingsley Shacklebolt's participation required the most delicate balance between official responsibilities and revolutionary activities, as his position within the ministry's oral department provided invaluable intelligence about government responses to emerging threats while creating potential conflicts of interest that could destroy his career and expose order operations if his dual loyalties were discovered by superiors whose political considerations often outweighed security concerns. His access to classified information about Death Eater investigations and witness protection programs made him crucial for coordinating order activities with legitimate law enforcement efforts, though the need to maintain his cover meant that much of his contribution had to remain invisible to colleagues who might otherwise have appreciated his insights and recommendations. His professional reputation for competence and integrity provided cover for activities that might have seemed suspicious if undertaken by someone whose loyalties were already questioned, while his diplomatic skills made him valuable for situations that required interaction with ministry officials who needed to be influenced without being directly approached by known order members whose involvement might compromise sensitive operations. The intelligence he provided about government capabilities and limitations allowed order leadership to develop strategies that exploited bureaucratic blind spots while avoiding direct confrontation with official authority that could result in legal complications for members whose civilian lives depended on maintaining clean records. The establishment of headquarters at 12 Grimmauld Place represented both practical necessity and symbolic reclamation, as Sirius Black's ancestral home provided space and security that other available properties couldn't match, while allowing the Order to operate from a location whose history embodied the kind of pure-blood ideology that Voldemort's movement sought to impose on magical society. The house's existing magical protections were extensive, but required updating to address contemporary threats, while the accumulated dark objects and ideological artifacts that filled its rooms served as constant reminders of the enemy's true nature and ultimate objectives for magical civilization. The cleaning process required to make the house habitable revealed both the scope of dark magic that had been practiced within its walls over generations and the psychological damage that such exposure had inflicted on family members who had grown up surrounded by objects that celebrated cruelty and promoted hatred as fundamental virtues. The portrait of Sirius's mother, permanently attached to the wall through magic that defied removal, provided unwelcome commentary on order activities while serving as voice for attitudes that many pure-blood families continued to hold despite Voldemort's apparent defeat 14 years earlier. Sirius's freedom from Azkaban had been purchased through ministry, acknowledgement of his innocence, but the psychological scars left by 12 years of imprisonment among Dementors had created damage that would never fully heal, affecting his judgment and emotional stability in ways that made him both more valuable and more dangerous as an Order operative. His intimate knowledge of Death Eater families and pure-blood social networks provided intelligence that couldn't be obtained through conventional sources, while his reckless courage and desire for action often conflicted with the careful planning that successful operations required under conditions where mistakes could be fatal for entire cells of resistance fighters. His relationship with Harry Potter was complicated by guilt over his failure to protect James and Lily, combined with determination to fulfill his responsibilities as godfather. Despite being completely unprepared for the parental role that circumstances had thrust upon him after years of imprisonment that had prevented normal emotional development and social adjustment, his influence on Harry's understanding of the magical world was profound but sometimes problematic, as his own experiences had been shaped by trauma and loss in ways that made him unsuitable as a guide for someone who needed stability and wisdom, rather than shared anger and desire for revenge against enemies who had destroyed their families. The recruitment of new members who had been too young to participate in the original Order brought fresh perspectives and capabilities that were essential for operations against enemies who had adapted their methods based on lessons learned from their previous defeat, while the enthusiasm and idealism that characterized younger recruits provided energy that veteran members sometimes lacked after years of civilian responsibilities that had dulled their appetite for the risks and sacrifices that resistance work demanded. The integration of different generations within the Order created both opportunities for knowledge transfer and potential conflicts over tactical approaches and acceptable risk levels. Severus Snape's continued role as double agent required even more sophisticated deception than had been necessary during the original war, as Voldemort's resurrection had been accompanied by enhanced security measures and more intensive surveillance of his followers that reflected hard-won knowledge about the vulnerabilities that had contributed to his previous Prenger's defeat. The psychological strain of maintaining false loyalty to someone whose return he had secretly worked to prevent was enormous, while the knowledge that discovery would mean not just death but prolonged torture made every interaction with Death Eater associates a test of acting abilities that few people could have sustained over extended periods. His position at Hogwarts provided cover for activities that would have been impossible for someone whose only connection to the magical community was through dark associations, while his access to students and staff created opportunities for intelligence gathering and recruitment that had to be balanced against the need to protect young people from involvement in activities that could destroy their lives and families. His teaching responsibilities had become secondary to his espionage work, though his classroom manner remained harsh enough to maintain the reputation for strictness and political neutrality that his cover identity required. The intelligence he provided about Voldemort's state of mind and strategic planning was invaluable for Order operations, though the information came at personal cost. That was evident to anyone who observed his increasing isolation and psychological deterioration under pressures that would have broken lesser individuals. His dedication to protecting Harry Potter was motivated by a complex mixture of guilt, love, and duty that he could never fully explain or justify to colleagues who questioned his reliability and motivations, while his knowledge of Lily's sacrifice created emotional burdens that affected every aspect of his service to Dumbledore's cause. Harry Potter's introduction to the Reformed Order represented both practical necessity and enormous risk, as his unique connection to Voldemort made him invaluable as a source of intelligence about their enemies' activities and state of mind, while also making him the highest priority target for assassination attempts that could eliminate the prophesied threat before it could fully develop. His placement with the Dursleys had provided magical protection that was absolute within narrow geographical boundaries, but had also isolated him from the magical education and social connections that would have better prepared him for the Pages, responsibilities that his destiny would require him to accept. His emotional reaction to learning about the Order's existence and his parents' role in its original formation revealed both the depth of his ignorance about his magical heritage and his desperate hunger for connection to the same community that should have been his birthright, while his immediate willingness to participate in dangerous activities demonstrated courage that exceeded his understanding of the risks involved in opposing enemies, whose capabilities and ruthlessness surpassed anything his sheltered upbringing had prepared him to comprehend. The balance between protecting him from premature exposure to threats he couldn't handle and providing him with knowledge necessary for his own survival required constant adjustment as circumstances changed and his abilities developed. The Department of Mysteries battle that erupted when Order members attempted to rescue him from a trap that had been carefully orchestrated to exploit his psychological vulnerabilities marked a turning point in both the war's intensity and Harry's understanding of what opposition to Voldemort would cost from everyone involved in such resistance. The casualties suffered during that confrontation included people whose loss would affect Order capabilities for years to come, while the public nature of the battle made continued government denial of Voldemort's return impossible, despite Minister Fudge's determination to maintain facades that had served his political interests throughout the crisis. Sirius Black's death during the battle was particularly devastating not just because of his tactical value to Order operations, but because of the psychological impact on Harry, who lost the closest thing to a father figure he had ever known, while learning harsh lessons about the consequences that heroic gestures could have for people who cared about the heroes more than they valued their own safety. The manner of his death, falling through the mysterious veil in the department's death chamber, created uncertainty about his fate that made grief more difficult to process, while raising questions about the nature of death itself that magical theory couldn't adequately address. The revelation of the prophecy's complete contents provided context for Voldemort's obsession with eliminating Harry, while creating new pressures on someone who was still essentially a child, despite the enormous responsibilities that fate and prophecy had placed on his shoulders. The knowledge that either he or Voldemort must die for the conflict to end transformed abstract opposition to evil into personal vendetta that would shape every aspect of his remaining adolescence and early adulthood, while the weight of such destiny created isolation even among people who understood and supported his mission. The Order's response to these developments required fundamental reassessment of strategies and priorities that had been based on assumptions about the enemy's capabilities and objectives that subsequent events had proven inadequate, while the increased visibility of their activities made security more difficult to maintain. When government officials were finally acknowledging the threats they faced and demanding cooperation with official law enforcement efforts that had different priorities and methods than revolutionary organizations could employ effectively. The Battle of Hogwarts, which came as the culmination of years of escalating conflict and increasingly desperate measures by both sides, demonstrated both the strength and limitations of the resistance movement that had grown from Dumbledore's original vision of principled opposition to genocidal ideology. The courage displayed by Order members who fought knowing that victory was uncertain and survival unlikely provided inspiration for students and staff who had never imagined they would face such tests, while the sacrifices made during that final confrontation ensured that future generations would understand the true price of freedom and the dedication required to preserve values that tyranny sought to destroy. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks died together during that battle, their love story ending in shared sacrifice that left behind orphaned son, whose upbringing would require the same kind of community support that had sustained Harry during his difficult childhood. While their deaths served as reminder that heroism was often measured not in glory, but in willingness to give everything for causes that exceeded personal interests or individual survival. Their legacy lived on in the magical world they had helped preserve, and in the child who would grow up knowing that his parents had died to protect values that made life worth living. The victory achieved through such terrible cost marked the end of Voldemort's threat, while establishing precedents for future resistance to tyranny that would influence magical society for generations to come, as the Order's example demonstrated that principled opposition to evil was possible even when success seemed impossible and sacrifice was certain. The phoenix that had given the organization its name had fulfilled its mythological purpose once again, rising from the ashes of individual lives to create something greater than its component parts, then providing the foundation for new growth that would continue long after the specific crisis that had created it was resolved through means that honored both the courage of those who fought and the memory of those who died in service to causes that transcended their own mortality. The magical world that emerged from the final battle was forever changed by the experience of systematic evil and the resistance that had ultimately overcome it, while the children who survived would carry forward understanding of vigilance and sacrifice that would protect future generations from similar threats if they ever emerged from the shadows where such darkness always waited for. Opportunities created by complacency and the assumption that evil belonged permanently to the past, rather than representing eternal possibilities that required constant opposition from those willing to pay whatever prices such opposition demanded. Rest now, young wizard, as our chronicle of the Order of the Phoenix draws to its peaceful close. In the quiet darkness of this magical hour, let yourself be comforted by the memory of heroes who chose courage over comfort, who stood in the shadows so others could live in the light. Their legacy lives on not in monuments or medals, but in every act of kindness that conquers cruelty, every moment when good wizards choose to stand together against the darkness. Like the phoenix that gave them their name, their spirits rise eternal from the ashes of sacrifice, inspiring new generations to carry forward the flame of hope. The Order taught us that heroism isn't found in the absence of fear, but in acting despite it, that love is indeed the most powerful magic of all, and that even in the darkest of times, there are always those who will choose to light a candle rather than curse the darkness. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere, always, there are those who keep watch in the tradition they established, guardians who ensure that the light of hope never truly dies.